Thrillers, mysteries, and noirs have always been fairly intriguing to me within the gaming landscape. It's a style that's nowhere near as common as you might expect, and even then it's a genre that I classify as being quite broad in how the gameplay is carried out. You've got games like Disco Elysium and Return of the Obra Dinn, where simply observing your surroundings and interacting with the events around you makes up the bulk of gameplay. There's also games like LA Noire and Heavy Rain, which, despite having a huge amount of positives, also get dragged down by their narratives at points. And in the case of LA Noire in particular, ends up having a fairly repetitive gameplay loop in spite of its fleshed out mechanics. Those are all games that I've played before, and I'd say on the whole I enjoyed my time with them. Return of the Obra Dinn proved how gripping and satisfying a mystery game can be if it's held up by immensely well designed gameplay and well written dialogue, bearing in mind there's not a whole lot of actual gameplay to see there. And LA Noire's atmosphere is still unbelievably great today. But the point is, these are all games that convey their narratives through a mystery, a format which for me can be very hit or miss depending on how it's carried out. For every broken sword, you could also get a Life is Strange, a game that I have so many issues with that it's almost inevitable I'll talk about it in the future.
Get out! Get out of the fucking car.
Hey, Chloe, you know you turned into a real piece of shit.
But as I said with Obra Dinn, when done right, it can present some of the most gripping narratives I've ever experienced, as due to the main point of these being discovering elements which are once hidden. It should be giving the player a constant feedback loop depending on their actions, slowly revealing things over time which the player may have previously been speculating over. And aside from Deadly Premonition, which might be one of my favourite games ever, I say that both ironically and somewhat unironically.
I can't believe it, this is fantastic. Really good.
There's one game series that seems to meet all of my personal criteria for a perfect noir thriller, and that's the Max Payne games. Developed by Remedy Entertainment and published by Rockstar Games, it's a series that, despite definitely being well known, doesn't get talked about anywhere near as much as some of Rockstar's other titles, at least not nowadays. The most frequent non-GTA games I see get mentioned in relation to Rockstar are ones like Red Dead, Bully, or Manhunt. Those are all good obviously, and are also all developed by Rockstar themselves, which I suppose makes Max Payne somewhat the only successful anomaly of the company. You had some really weird ones, like Surfing H3O and Austin Powers' Oh Behave.
Yeah, baby!
But those were basically one-offs that were released early into the company's foundation, and although Max Payne will ultimately turn out to be a success, it's something Rockstar stayed firmly away from for the most part. Back to Remedy though, before Max Payne they only had one game release under their belt, that being Death Rally, and although it initially appears like a top-down game akin to Grand Theft Auto or Micro Machines, I've only really heard positive things in relation to this first release. I haven't played it extensively myself, but the game was praised for aspects like its blending of combat and racing, as well as the frequent new cars and upgrades you'll be unlocking throughout the game. The point is, although Max Payne was only their second title, they'd already shown enough promise to be picked up by companies like Rockstar, which is a pretty impressive feat, especially when you take into account the period this was made, with creating and releasing games being a far more convoluted and restrictive process compared to nowadays, when you can knock something up in Unity in a couple hours or so. The interesting thing about this series is that despite appearing like a standard third-person shooter on the surface, with Tomb Raider being a big influence on the game, it's held up by the incredibly original and satisfying gameplay, as well as a story that's being written by one of the few actual auteurs in gaming. You of course have people like Kojima and Miyamoto, but I don't think Sam Lake gets anywhere near enough credit for how distinct and unique his stories are. When Max Payne was starting to be teased to the public, they took the approach of attempting to show off the sheer graphical fidelity, as due to Remedy using their own engine known as Max FX, they'd included some genuinely innovative visuals for the time that no one had really done before, the most noticeable of which being their particle system in relation to aspects like the game's fire, smoke, and explosions, with guns having smoking barrels after firing out bullets, and hundreds of snow particles filling up the screen to create a dense atmosphere. But outside of some changes like the game originally being called Dark Justice, and also how the game basically got completely revamped between the period of its first trailer and its release, let's get straight into the game and start making observations for ourselves. The first thing a new player will immediately be struck by is easily the title screen. The actual presentation of it I think is rather dated, with everything being completely static, but it's the first time we hear the Max Payne theme, one of the best themes in gaming history. I talk about this more in my music and video games video which I made a while ago, but despite this theme being a constant throughout all three games, you'll find that over time the new iterations of the song perfectly encapsulates the increasing feeling of complete hopelessness from Max himself, as well as how dark the events eventually get in the future. From the intro alone, the game immediately grabs your attention by throwing us right to the ending, before then taking us back to the beginning. It's a narrative technique that isn't uncommon, but even then, they somehow make it a distinct staple of all three games as we'll eventually see. Although the opening cutscene is actually rendered out in in-game. This is pretty much the only exception in relation to how the cutscenes in this game are presented, and it's easily one of the best decisions that was made during the game's development. As although the game definitely doesn't look bad when looking at it by itself, which we'll talk about more in a sec, comparing it to other games that were released in 2001 does show the technology to be slightly behind the curve. It's a bit unfair admittedly, as 2001 seemed to be one of the best years in gaming history, seeing releases like MGS2, Devil May Cry, Halo, Silent Hill 2 and Eco just to name a few. And I mean, this closing image of the cutscene says it all really.
And then it was over.
The particle effects may be impressive, but that just looks ridiculous. There's definitely a charm to the faces in this game. They're so bizarre to me that it almost comes with the positive of being undeniably memorable. But the fact is, they don't even replicate this style on the game's sequel, which was also made using the Max Effects engine, so I can't help but just look at this as a technical drawback. But, due to the developers' active knowledge of that fact, along with the concern around going majorly over budget, they opt to introduce these comic book style panels instead of your standard in-game animated cutscenes. This is such a brilliant decision, although I'm not entirely sure where it came from, which for me makes the choice all the more impressive. The game's noir aesthetic is obviously set right from the get-go, but applying that in a graphic novel sense akin to comics like Batman and Sin City is a stroke of genius in my opinion. I not only imagine they saved quite a bit of the game's budget by doing this, but also managed to set its presentation far apart from anything else anyone was doing at the time. Not to mention, the artwork itself looks fantastic, being what I assume is a blend between these gothic stylized drawings and also some actual photography, with Max and many of the other characters in these cutscenes looking far more realised than their in-game models. As you could assume by the title of the game, I think Max is the be and end all of the entire series. The events which play out around him and some of the characters he meets are all good in their own right, but without Max himself, I don't think any of it would really matter. The story's conveyed completely through his sole perspective. Anything outside of what's troubling him is ultimately irrelevant. It's a story about Max alone, and because of that, it's important they got the character right, and on all accounts, they absolutely did.
I went for the hotel first. It was a sad old thing with flickering lamps and faded colors, cheap mobster punks and tired-eyed prostitutes.
I think for many, Max Payne might initially seem like a blank slate, and if you were to randomly ask me about any defining factors of his character, I'm not sure I'd be able to list them off without making him sound incredibly generic. He's a cop who ultimately ends up having to get his hands dirty because of a personal tragedy which we'll see in a bit. But when observing the nuances of his character, he turns out to be an immensely rich and individualized figure, which is mainly down to the writing, as well as the performance from James McCaffrey. The best part about his character, as we'll see, is that he's someone who does genuinely change throughout all three entries, but it's done in such a way where it doesn't feel either forced or unwarranted. As we see in this opening cutscene, Max is a clean-cut and rather content person, with a wife and baby waiting for him when he gets home.
See? My last smoke. It's bad for the baby.
That's you, Max. A regular Boy Scout.
It might seem initially strange to someone like me who's played the other two games to a far greater extent, but it's important that he starts off like this to emphasize his descent into a spiraling depression as we continue. I will say though, starting off, I'm not sure the performance really matches the tone here. I know that's literally his voice, but you'd assume lines like "see you, Alex,"
See you, Alex.
would be delivered with some kind of offhanded laugh and smirk, much like we see in the panel, but he says it like Alex just told him to piss off. But you'll notice that after this, the way things are described appears to be so detailed and enthralling to hear play out, which stays a constant throughout the series. It's one of the best parts admittedly, even for someone like me who's not particularly a wordsmith, and doesn't have a profound appreciation for language and how it can be constructed. All credit goes to Sam Lake for this aspect, being the sole writer of both Max Payne 1 and 2, creating a perfectly sinister atmosphere, even when we're told life was good, and weaving numerous metaphors and symbolic references throughout these games, while for me, never being too on the nose or pretentious. I know that'll likely not be the case for a lot of people, but I've always enjoyed the metaphorical divulgences Max frequently finds himself getting into.
The station was drenched in gloom. Alex was a ghost, nowhere to be seen. I'd have to look for him.
It establishes his mindset better, and in turn makes the player understand him better as a character, defining him as a recognizable protagonist, and not just some nobody. This first level is once again much more of a setup compared to being gameplay focused. But if the player hasn't already attempted the training mode, which I personally think is a very outdated feature, despite being somewhat helpful, it lets them get to grips with how Max moves, as well as eventually what the shooting's like. It's once again the atmosphere here which grips the player instantly. It's already pretty clear the scenario that's playing out, but the presentation of it is very cinematic, which is the case for the rest of these games. Sometimes the influences are subtle, with its oftentimes Tarantino-esque dialogue.
You'll get enough guns to start the apocalypse. You in or out?
Let's get this show on the road.
But at the same time, we also see overt references to shows like Twin Peaks, with filmmakers like David Lynch, John Woo, and of course the Wachowskis being very obvious influences on both the style and gameplay. The way this starts isn't as much of a contrast as it is a more blatant show of horror. It's a slow build-up, which much like I mentioned a mystery should do, instills countless questions into the player's head, which will eventually be answered later on. These would be things like what the V and the syringe on the wall meant, who phoned up Max's phone.
Is this the Payne residence?
Yes, someone's broken into my house. They're still here. You have to...
Good. I'm afraid I cannot help you.
It doesn't matter that the player doesn't currently know these things. It's almost letting them know how out of their depth they are, which makes the ultimate revelation of these things all the more satisfying. The overall point of this segment is to set up Max's motivations, arguably for the series as a whole, as when we eventually go upstairs to investigate the commotion, it's revealed that Max's wife and baby have been murdered by some drug addicts amped up on a drug called Valkyr, commonly referred to as V.
No, please God, no.
Even today, games stay pretty far away from this kind of stuff, so it was somewhat genuinely shocking to see an actual dead baby, albeit being covered up by a blanket. If you're a child hater, you can attempt to kill them in Skyrim, but they restrict you from fully killing them. And even games like GTA, which seem to do things purposely for controversy, still stay away from the idea of harming children. Of course, you don't actually kill it, but still, a bloody cot and a little dead baby hand was shocking enough to take me aback slightly. Although, that was almost immediately put off when we discover our wife.
No!
This happens a couple times throughout this game, and every time it is awful. James McCaffrey is great, but for some reason it seemed like he couldn't shout at all in this game. It's like a kid who doesn't want to wake up his parents. That's not the only criticism I have about the voice acting in this game either, but we'll talk about that later. This is the turning point where Max Payne becomes a cold-hearted killer, with it being told rather swiftly in the period of only a few slides that it took Max around 3 years to get onto this Valkyr case, going undercover, and heading after a trafficker called Jack Lupino. This is the first real level where we get to experiment around with the gameplay, so let's take a deep look into it, and try to see why Max Payne is still held up as one of the best shooters released in the early 2000s. I fret to say ever, as although the foundation gets firmly laid here, it does have some genuine issues that end up being perfected as the games go on. Starting with the most obvious features, Max Payne of course sets itself apart for a very good reason, and that's the bullet time. Staying very close to its Matrix influences, with one button press you can both slow down time, which is what's officially described as the bullet time, but also dive through the air, which also activates this slowdown effect. First off, I think it's a miracle they managed to implement this so well. There's not many, if any, games I can think of at this time that actively put in a feature that manipulated the core gameplay to this degree. On the surface, it's incredibly stylish anyway, seeing bullets slowly gliding towards you, while also getting a much better opportunity to witness some of the muzzle flash and smoke effects in a greater amount of detail. But thinking about it deeper, it's amazing this feature still presents such a great flow to the gameplay. Bullet time in itself is a function that actively slows down the player and everything around them, but firefights seem to have the exact opposite effect. Bullet time only makes them feel even more intense and fast-paced to me. The bullet time's main function on its own, of course, is all related to incoming and outgoing damage. It gives the player the opportunity to observe and dodge any bullets that are coming their way, as well as giving them more time to plan out their own approach, and how to most effectively eliminate the enemies in front of them. Compared to the other two games though, it's easily the most unrefined iteration of this mechanic, which I suppose is a given in some ways, although bullet time is still very distinctly Max Payne, and presents an even more satisfying and effective way to mow down your enemies. There are some issues I have in relation to the diving, and the actual speed of the bullet time. We'll of course talk about how they switch things up later on, but to start with, I've never been that satisfied with how diving works in this game. Not only do I think it oftentimes looks rather sloppy, in most cases looking less like an actual dive and more just sliding across the floor, but it's also an element that seemed to get me in more trouble than necessary. It's of course presenting the game's John Woo influences very blatantly, and if we're judging the game on its own merits, the dive would have looked great for the time. It's only the fact we've got the other two games where we can notice that the height and distance of the actual dive can be increased to be far more effective and impressive to look at. Its main function is of course to propel you in a certain direction, to both stylishly take out your enemy, while at the same time hopefully negating any incoming bullets that were previously travelling towards you. It's very important in this game though that you time it right, as upon landing you'll take around a second to get back up and start firing again. That was something that initially annoyed me with this game, but ultimately I'm not sure it's too bad in theory. The other two games don't do this. They give you the option to continue firing on the ground until you get back up, and in the case of Max Payne 3 you can even keep firing while you're picking yourself up from the ground. Those are also fine obviously, but there's something about this first version which requires more skill. It's clunky for sure, and definitely not perfect, but that's something I'm willing to give the game a pass on, bearing in mind this is not only the first Max Payne game, but the first third-person shooter Remedy ever made. There's also the overall speed of this bullet time, which as I've said, would have been fine for the time. In fact, it would have been amazing, but it's just too slow when you realise how much more intense they could have made it, and will make it in the future. The mistake I've seen people make with this first game, even on the wikis that I've looked at, is that they describe it as a feature which slows the environment down, but not the player. This is true for the other two games, but simply isn't the case for the first one. In this game, everything gets slowed down, which means in the case of Max, not only are his bullets travelling towards people at a slower pace, but it also reduces the speed of his movement, making the effectiveness of the bullet time in relation to dodging bullets far less useful. It's brilliant in a visual sense, and don't get me wrong, you'll likely need to be using this stuff constantly to stay alive, but there's definitely room for improvement. But hey, that's what sequels are for. If everything was perfect here, the experience of the second game would have likely felt like more of the same. You do have to manage how long you actually use this for, however, because as you can notice in the bottom left beside your health bar, there's an hourglass which correlates to the amount of bullet time you have saved up. Whenever you activate it, either on foot or while diving, the meter starts going down, with the only way to replenish it being to eliminate enemies. This is great, as it means players won't be able to abuse the mechanic to make the game incredibly easy, and also has the effect of encouraging players to go on the offensive while using bullet time, as there's rarely a case in the game where you want to be taking on a group of enemies without it. Bullet time overall was a fantastic and wholly original mechanic in a gaming sense. It's not only eye candy for the player, as you're given the ability to wipe out a room full of enemies all while played out in slow motion, but in relation to other aspects, like how ruthless and dangerous the enemies can be, it becomes a feature that's essential to use as the game goes on, which I think is brilliant, as it not only presents quite a challenge even on the easiest difficulty, but makes full use of what's basically its USP, sticking in players' minds even more by being used so frequently. Back to the events which are playing out in the story. After getting informed there might be a lead to the aforementioned Jack Lapino, we head to Roscoe's station to meet up with our partner Alex. Naturally, this doesn't go to plan, as after only a few minutes we witness a policeman lying dead surrounded by blood, and then subsequently being discovered by Lapino's men, which we eventually see are crawling all throughout the station. The way the story's conveyed outside of the cutscenes here isn't all that well put together in my opinion, and sometimes even appears amateurish. There's subtleties hidden around the environment which I liked, such as the Aesir Corporation poster that we see when getting off the train, which we'll eventually discover is a pharmaceutical company that's secretly behind the manufacturing of the Valkyr drug. That stuff's good, as it's setting observant players up with the knowledge of this company right to begin with, but also upon replaying the game you'll gain further appreciation for how this story's revealed in the subtlest details. My only issue here are some of the narrative beats that are confined within the gameplay. Although most cutscenes are in the graphic novel style, there's a few in-game ones scattered throughout the game, which further makes me realise how great the graphic novel idea was, because although you are actually witnessing the events and not just looking at static images, they just appear to be shoddily put together. Look at this one for example, which starts off brilliantly with this amazing slow motion explosion. But then quickly becomes strange when stumbling across our partner Alex. Just listen to the dialogue here.
What the hell's going on? There are more corpses here than at the city morgue.
It's an armed robbery, a tunnel job straight to the Roscoe Bank vault through the old station wall. Is this why? This is Lapino's gig?
This is Lapino's doing? Lapino's men?
Not only does it get cut off halfway through one of Max's sentences,
Through the old station wall. Is this why?
but the bit after has them asking questions back and forth like something out of Monty Python.
This is Lapino's gig?
This is Lapino's doing? Lapino's men?
And then when Alex gets shot,
Lapino, it's... Alex? Alex!
There was nothing I could do. He was dead.
I mean, what even is this? It plays out so quickly, you barely even understand what's going on. And it's not like we even have any connection to the character Alex. We've seen him once up to this point. That's not the only issue I have here though, with my other big annoyance being the clues that you find around each level. These are always indicated to you with a grey exclamation mark, letting you know an object nearby is able to be interacted with, which will in turn bring you into a cutscene. As I've established, I like the style here much better, but interspersing them between the gameplay, and quite frequently in some cases, just feels like it's putting a stop to our flow once again. This is more of of a nitpick compared to my previous point, but it's still something I definitely noticed, even despite the content of these still being up to par with everything else. After we deal with the thugs in the station, we end up in a rundown hotel while trying to track down Lupino, where we once again take on tons of enemies. That's basically the gist of every level, which I think is perfectly fine. Much like how you don't have to watch all the cutscenes and find all the clues. If you don't find yourself attaching to the story, they still make the majority of levels action-packed and tapping into its best mechanics. And talking of the levels, I want to focus on the world and level design for a second, something that I've been wishing to talk about for a while due to my recent delve into non-linear open world games. And although Max Payne is definitely linear, I'd say I've always thought of it as rather open compared to other games in its genre. Taking a step back to the train station level, the way it's laid out has a brilliant escalation to inform the player of how this game's going to primarily play out. There's an element of discovery immediately with this game, due to the fact that unlike many shooters, you're not guided at all. The game really doesn't hold your hand in any aspect. You get off the train and are simply told to investigate. You'll notice in the first few enemy encounters, both of which are placed to give the player an indication they're heading in the right direction. There's no real cover to be seen. Typically, you'd see wooden boxes or concrete walls to hide behind. But cleverly, to encourage the player to use bullet time, there's a clear absence of these things, which to me not only makes the environments feel far more authentic, with the train station simply looking like a train station and not a crash course, but it's also great in how it's pushing the player in the right direction, while at the same time going completely unsaid. You will find there are moments where some forms of cover will be placed around, but I assume due to the fact they wanted players to be frequently diving all over the place. There's a real sense of space, even in some of the densest environments in the game. Although most of the encounters we see over the course of the game are fairly standard, like enemies busting into rooms one after another, or simply waiting to ambush you, there are quite a few standout moments which we'll eventually see, with certain moments where the verticality the levels employ is put to great effect, with enemies coming from numerous directions both above, below, and on the same level as you. Naturally, this kind of stuff keeps the players on their toes, and thus more engaged in the gameplay. The environments themselves definitely have a style to them, although this rarely varies that much. There's a definite darkness and sense of decay to all these areas. There's rarely a moment where you're witnessing anything outside of the rusty metal doors, filthy carpets, and torn wallpapers. I love the style, it fits perfectly with the game's dark noir tone, but at the same time I could also see players getting somewhat restless of how the game looks. I say that with only one caveat, and that's in relation to the nightmare sequences. The first game is easily the weirdest out of the trilogy, and is the most blatant with its art house influences. You'd assume, or at least I'd assume, that trying to mix a John Woo action with the mystery of Seven, while at the same time mixing that with elements like Norse mythology and the occult, could only end up resulting in a jumbled up mess. And although I'd say the game's definitely unconventional in that front, it creates a unique kind of atmosphere that I can only relate to this first game. It's strange, as the other two go far away from some of the things this first one touches on, those aforementioned Norse and occult themes being presented the most obviously, with Lupino eventually turning out to be a Satan-worshipping nut. But as a standalone piece, it definitely presents a lot of ideas for the player to think about. Although the story might be a fairly simple one of revenge, it's the elements around that which could become more interesting. We'll focus on that later though. Anyways, back to those nightmare sequences. I am a big fan of these. They're great in terms of the freaky things they present anyway, with the colour and effects being used especially well here to create a brilliantly stylized and, I'd say, authentic depiction of what a nightmare can be like. The colour and lighting is something that's great across the board obviously, with the neon signs and drinks machines oftentimes creating a contrast against the worn down and dark environments. But these nightmare sequences take things to a different level, having an emphasis on colours like red and blue, having actual implications in relation to the narrative, with it linking to the murder of his wife and child. The only unfortunate part about these is that although the atmosphere is hands down the best part, they can oftentimes be tedious to get through. This is because in all three that are across the game, every single one features a completely black room with blood trails going across the floor. The visuals once again great, especially with what appears to be the blood that's raining down in the air, but the fact that you've got to follow these blood trails so closely is just annoying. I found the movement to not be tight enough for this kind of platforming, which is an issue that both sequels end up avoiding, and the fact these moments are so restrictive, as well as downright confusing, goes against the majority of level design in this game. Overall though, the level and world design is pretty great in every aspect. It's got both benefits of having immensely satisfying and fleshed out gameplay, and also environments that accommodate this, both in relation to how they're laid out and what challenges are thrown at the player along the way. And as we just saw with the nightmares, they're also not afraid to take the weapons away and slow things down a bit, to create a genuinely freaky atmosphere that will likely be the parts that will stick with the player the longest. By the time you reach chapter 5, thus dealing with the situation at the hotel, and also getting introduced to the character Vlad, you would have noticed that one thing this game handles very well is its subtleties. In what seems to be my obligatory MGS2 reference, it's not as detailed as that obviously, but there's still a huge amount of things that are personalized around the environment, as well as a large amount of things to interact with. The start of this chapter is great in showing this off, as when you're out on the streets, you not only get to experience the snowfall and wonderfully isolating ambience, but you'll notice that all the surrounding shops are also individualized, with different types of signs trying to attract passers-by. Another thing this one shows off is something that will be expanded quite majorly in the sequel, with us being able to enter the pawnbroker to get a unique combat encounter. In the scheme of the level, it's not actually necessary to go here, but if the player is observant enough to try and enter, they'll end up being rewarded with an Ingram, a weapon which doesn't become easily available both before and quite a while after this point. Then going even deeper, the effects in relation to your bullets both have the impact of making gunfights appear even more stylish, while at the same time bringing an element of destruction to your surroundings. Shooting still has all the style of those initial gameplay trailers, with smoke bursting out after every shot, the muzzle flash being fast and bright, and also seeing sparks come out of your weapon as well. Using these on enemies unfortunately doesn't have any substantial effect on them, which is a shame considering GTA 3 came out the very same year and featured a fantastic dismemberment system. No bullet holes can be noticeably seen when taking enemies out, and the most significant thing you'll notice is the blood which is left on the ground. But if you end up missing your shots on these targets, you'll notice that depending on what you hit, the surrounding objects have a wide variety in how they react. Shooting a concrete wall, for example, will result in bullet holes accurately being left, and also seeing the place of impact burst out with smoke and debris. Shooting things like wood and cardboard boxes has a similar effect obviously, but there's also smaller things like drink cans and TVs scattered around, which will also uniquely react to your bullets. Talking of drink cans, there's also a wide amount of interactivity in these levels too. On the most basic level, this can boil down to searching cupboards and cabinets in hopes to perhaps find some more weaponry or healing. But there's also things like the beds in the hotel mission, all of which have a red button beside them which makes them start shaking, some of which are also secretly hiding items. And there's even things like slot machines that you can interact with, and drinks machines which, as we just saw, actually spit out drink cans. There's just tons of stuff to observe here, a lot of which I simply won't be able to go over. But everything from being able to see Max's breath in the cold air, to all the different bullet casings that get shot out of whatever gun you're using, to the huge number of TVs scattered across the game which present similar programs to that of Star Trek and Twin Peaks. All of this simply proves the game to be immensely detailed in a number of areas. The most substantial switch up to the gameplay scenario so far is when we eventually stumble across Vinny Gognitti, where upon injuring the guy, we're made to chase after him. This does basically have near to no impact though, outside of mentally making the player feel a sense of urgency. There's no time limit, for example. You can take as long as you want and you won't actually fail, which ultimately I think is a better decision. So I think it's time to discuss the enemy's AI, and how elements like their damage outputs and their aim drastically affects how you'll be approaching each encounter. Now I'm not entirely sure what the common consensus for the AI here is, but for me, I'm rather mixed in my feelings about it. The enemy's behavior initially seems quite interesting and nuanced, with there being many instances where you'll hear them talking amongst each other, either right in front of you or behind doors, until you eventually reveal yourself, where they'll then go right for you.
Gentlemen, let's do business. Green for green. Cheers, a green-eyed angel. Got him down.
And it's when you get into these actual gunfights where their flaws start to become slightly more present. It's fine for the type of game this is. I don't think any casual player will have an issue here, unless they're getting annoyed at the difficulty to begin with. But I've realised over time that enemies in this first game are rather inconsistent. First off, this isn't about their placement. There was rarely a moment where I thought there were too many to deal with, or simply that they weren't placed in believable positions. You'll find that most of these will either be standing out in the open, and oftentimes, once your presence becomes known, they'll start waiting for your arrival, crouching behind filing cabinets and tipping over tables for cover. That's all great, but it's when the guns start firing where they seem to go off the rails slightly. They tend to make a beeline straight towards you, which I've always thought is a rather lazy way to keep the player on their toes. I'd understand if there was a specific type of melee-based enemy whose sole purpose was to throw the player off, but it's the case for a large amount of the enemies here. It makes a weird contrast towards that subtle humanizing of these guys that we can observe in their conversations. They go from slimy mobsters to the Terminator, with no fear or consideration to their well-being in the slightest. The most obvious reason I can see to why they do this this though is because of the sheer damage they can get off on you, although their aim can oftentimes be very off the mark, which you can see all the more clearly when using bullet time, with them usually trying to predict where you're heading as opposed to just shooting you. It's the incredible amount of damage they give out which will always keep you on your toes. They may be inaccurate a lot of the time, but when they get shots off, you can definitely feel it. You get notified of this damage with a brief flash of red, as well as noticing your health bar in the bottom left has now turned partially red. Just small things like that are so memorable and unique, making the health bar personalized, but also effective in conveying how much damage you've taken, and how long it will take for your healing to truly take effect. As I said though, the AI in general was very hit or miss for me, which is mainly down to how they're set up. During this point in gaming, having extremely well developed AI was simply not a thing. It's very clear to see that when the enemies are supposedly flanking you and calling out to their mates about your presence, that's just a smokescreen to make them feel more realistic. The fact is, they're put in places and made to react a certain way, due to the developer's exact knowledge of how you'll enter these encounters. You're always going to be walking through the same door or gateway, so in reality, there's not much that's actually dynamic about these guys. That's fine, of course, I'm not even criticizing this particularly, it just gives me an even deeper understanding of the praise games like Fear got, as in that game, the enemies don't just communicate with each other, but also actively adapt to a number of situations they can find themselves in. Overall though, I think they're good enough, but once again have room for improvement. Without the high damage output, I don't think they'd be anywhere near as threatening, and I do think they're rather inconsistent in relation to the damage they actually take. A close shotgun blast to us could kill us immediately, whereas they can apparently take one to the chest and shake it off. But they serve their purpose. Their sole function should really be to be intense and dangerous, so adding personality building subtleties on top of this, and scripting them in a way where they at least appear to be employing certain tactics like flanking, is even more of a positive. We eventually end up being given Lupino's location from Gogniti, that being the Ragnarok nightclub. Ragnarok is of course once again a reference to Norse mythology, something which starts to get explored much more closely in this level due to Lupino's insane involvement with both this and the occult, in what I assume is the game taking influence from Twin Peaks once again. Max Payne uses the initial scenario of revenge to explore a far broader range of themes. Much like how Laura Palmer was the jumping off point to introduce tons of new characters, the murder of your wife and baby is used to the same effect. The Norse theme might be the most interesting to me, as although it's shown off fairly blatantly at some points, much like how the Satanism aspect is shown off in this one, it's also injected into a few elements while going completely unsaid. The Ragnarok Club is obvious, but when exploring Norse mythology itself, you can start to realise how multiple characters in this game are serving as a parallel for some of the figures in these Norse texts. Lupino, for example, is an Italian phrase which translates to little wolf, which could possibly link to the wolf Fenrir, who actually ends up killing Odin in the events of Ragnarok. Odin's also represented by the character Alfred Woden, who we see later on, with their names not only sounding alike, with Woden actually being a different name which Odin was known by, but also in the man's appearance. He shares the same singular one eye which Odin was also defined by. There's tons of this stuff, going all the way down to the Valkyr drug, which is part of the Valhalla project, clearly being allusions to both the Valkyries in these Norse stories, as well as Valhalla, which is described as a majestic hall located in Asgard. It's all interesting stuff if you're actually interested in Norse mythology, but my only issue with it is that I'm not entirely sure they merged that well with the game. I can appreciate Sam Lake wanting to include a variety of things that he enjoys, but I have a difficult time linking these elements to the game's events in any meaningful way. Perhaps it's not trying to, but with such a large subject, I'd expect it to have bigger implications outside of just references to these Norse texts and figures. The satanic elements are still very present at a certain point, but due to them being more in relation to the character of Lupino, they somewhat fade away after the point we take him out. Lying around Ragnarok are numerous books, pentagrams, and Ouija boards to show how far down this rabbit hole Lupino's gotten. Once again, although specific references are made to genuine pieces of text, I'm not sure there's any actual point to these outside of just saying Lupino's gone crazy.
Old exotic titles like Malleus Maleficarum and Deum Rerum Reini Novum Portus, books with pentagrams on their covers all dealing with the occult and the infernal, lying between stacks of horror videos and a couple of Ouija boards.
They may do, and perhaps I'm just not seeing it, but at this point in time for me, analysing this closer has unfortunately given me the mindset that this stuff is slightly pretentious. It's throwing these things at the player without having any real purpose to the story, almost like you're getting flexed on for not knowing about these things, even though knowing them doesn't particularly give you any greater insight. I'd say that's the only issue I have with this story. It can occasionally go way too detailed for essentially no reason. If the things you're presenting have no correlation to the actual plot, especially in a game where the main plot point is about killing people out of revenge, they feel like somewhat irrelevant padding. And I'm pretty sure Sam Lake must have recognized this, as in the future he manages to weave this intensely rich and detailed writing with themes that correlate much closer to the actual plot. The story doesn't matter too much here, with Max eventually taking down Lupino and then setting his eyes on Nicole Horn, who ends up being the main antagonist and also the head of the Aesir company. We meet her initially when being ambushed, and then being given an overdose of Valkyr, taking us to the final, strangest nightmare sequence.
The floor turned into a vortex of green blood. I fell.
They still feature the same scenarios, including your wife and baby's death. But then, some interesting questions start to get asked, that I'd assume not many players would even be thinking of to begin with. The way this nightmare is conveyed is particularly desolate, with there being this constant drone ringing in the background.
No, please, Max, no! I'm sorry. Please don't, Max, no, please.
And then eventually when we cross the dark room once again, that gets contrasted with almost complete silence. The weirdest part though is easily the fourth wall break we see here. We end up going round in circles for a while, picking up a phone a couple times where Max is then told that he's stuck inside a graphic novel, and then that he's stuck inside a video game.
You're in a computer game, Max.
The truth was a burning green crack through my brain, weapon statistics hanging in the air glimpsed out of the corner of my eye, endless repetition of the act of shooting, time slowing down to show off my moves, the paranoid feel of someone controlling my every step.
It's just another standout moment which is solely unique to this first entry. They don't go anywhere near to being this blatant in either of the two other games. Although once again, I feel like that may simply be a refinement in how the game's written. As despite this moment being memorable, it definitely sticks out as the only time this ever happens, but serves its purpose well when screwing with our heads. Which also happens when finding our wife again, this time being implied that Max in fact murdered her.
Murderer! You killed her!
It's such an interesting development that admittedly we had no prior knowledge or clues to previously speculate over, but it puts the events of the game in a different context if we choose to genuinely believe Max did this. It's likely just Max putting himself in the shoes of the killer in his own head, for not being there to protect them. But if we take it as a literal suppression of the idea of him killing them, it makes us realise Max is an absolute psychopath. He killed his wife and baby and then went out for retribution, wiping out hundreds of men along the way, which despite being involved in crime are still human beings. I don't think it's something I'd personally believe, as if it's true and Max is the murderer, it leaves me with almost no sympathy for his character going forward, on top of having no trust, because since we're seeing everything through the eyes of Max, and being told the events of the game solely by him, it brings up the idea of an unreliable narrator. Let's focus more on Max himself, as by the time you reach the closing hours of the game, you'll be able to acquire pretty much every single weapon the game has to offer, as well as also being thrown some of the largest threats up to that point. We've already talked about Max's movement, but the most important part of course is how the weapons handle, and what variety we've got to choose from. And I think this game is still damn impressive, both in how many they give you, while at the same time having all of these different weapon types bring their own individual positives and drawbacks. We have two pistols for example, the Beretta and Desert Eagle, which much like the Ingrams can also be dual wielded to have a higher fire rate and a much larger chance to get your shots off. The Beretta is arguably the most common weapon you'll find, meaning you'll likely always have ammo for it, whereas the Deagle is more effective in taking out enemies, having a higher damage output and being far more accurate, so as a result is less common to find. With that alone, you can see there's a good understanding of the balance here, with there never being a moment where I felt completely strapped for ammunition, but also having many moments where I felt the need to conserve particular weapons, which I know will be more vital later on. The reason you need to consider this is that ammo, despite not being a rarity, is never actually restocked automatically for you. You'll get a lot of ammo from simply scavenging the dead bodies that pile up along the way, with each enemy dropping their weapon, which you can then either acquire or take the ammo from. But that still might not be enough, which brilliantly then encourages the player to scavenge around the environment, with there being numerous things to observe in each level and then take advantage of, like the cabinets and cupboards which you can open up, which usually have some form of ammo in them. But there's also certain platforming challenges that will end up giving you an even better selection of weapons and ammo, rewarding the player for being observant and diverting from the obvious path. It might not be the case always, but taking your time to go through the environment carefully is more often than not always rewarded in some fashion. Back to the weapons, we've got shotguns, an assault rifle, an SMG, and some more unique ones like a sniper and a grenade launcher. There's clearly room for even more expansion here, but there's enough here that each individual one serves its own purpose, with that purpose being fairly substantial. The shotgun, for example, gives out a large amount of damage, but for most of the game you'll only be getting access to the pump action, which means you're going to have to trade off the damage for the potential chance of your shots missing, or having your shot not kill the enemy. It's an intentional balance which could result in you killing enemies rapidly, or getting yourself killed rapidly, and it's an aspect that despite being frustrating at points due to somewhat of an inconsistency and unreality when using the weapon, I like the idea of having a risk involved. You're sacrificing a fast fire rate for raw damage. Naturally, this means weapons like the Ingram and Commando should be your go-to weapon, weapons. But cleverly, despite being the most effective weapons here, they're also considerably rarer and have the tendency to lose quite a lot of ammo in rapid succession if you're not being careful and accurate. The only real issue I have in relation to all elements of the combat is Max's aim. The fragility of him is perfect, the arsenal of weapons are expansive and have specific functions, but for some reason Max's aim is all over the place here. Obligatory Kane and Lynch 2 reference here. I have no idea how that game got so much stick for having inaccurate weapons, while I've never heard this criticism with Max Payne. I suppose if you wanted to apply it to the story, you could convince yourself you're playing as Max while he's still learning the ropes. But that's clutching at straws really. I have no idea why the spread of weapons like the pistol is so large, especially because the only indication of where your bullets are going is a tiny dot in the middle of the screen. It's not a huge issue of course, just a nonsensical one that got me into more trouble than I thought was needed. There are also some throwables like grenades and molotovs, as well as melee weapons, but I also found these far too much trouble to use effectively. The baseball bat and lead pipe are pretty much wholly irrelevant to this game. There's near to no opportunities to use these outside of breaking open boxes, and one scenario where you're forced to use the baseball bat. They literally didn't need to be here at all, and don't get brought back in either of the other two games. And although throwables aren't a bad idea in theory, they oftentimes lead to you being far too vulnerable, as you need to actively swap them out for one of your other weapons, which in turn means you'll need to give yourself a large window to throw these without getting killed, while at the same time actually landing it in an area that the enemies are at, which is quite difficult considering they're always moving around. Analysing the player combat makes you realise how integral the bullet time is here. It not only makes the game playable, as I assume the intense fast pace of the game would end up turning a large amount of players away from the game, but also ends up boosting the somewhat generic shooting mechanics into something very fresh. The sound of this game is also something that shouldn't be overlooked, both in relation to the loud and punchy guns and explosions we hear almost non-stop, but also in the game's quieter moments. The ambience is always fantastic. There's not really any weapon-related sounds I can point out as being even the slightest bit wrong. They're all individualized and reflect perfectly the type of weapon you're using. The Berettas don't make an incredible impact, but still clearly have force to them. Whereas the shotguns sound absolutely devastating with every shot. This game can get very loud and cluttered, with explosions oftentimes sounding fairly similar, but also being grand and almost like they're peaking the audio levels. But this grandiosity serves a great contrast to the game's quieter moments, the ones where you'll either be navigating your way forward, or perhaps doing some platforming to break up the near-endless shooting. It's fairly simplistic when you're in the interiors of buildings like the hotel, but it's still vehemently effective, having a nice hollow wind to reflect these decrepit surroundings. But then when observing the exteriors like the city streets, we get this fantastically isolating soundscape of distant traffic and wind, with horns beeping and cars revving up in the distance. It gives a sense of claustrophobia and loneliness, which is backed up even further by the tall buildings, and also the knowledge that we're completely on our own. And not to mention, the music here is on point with every single track. It's got a perfect reflection of the game's darkness, but also the discovery that comes along with it. It can jump between incredibly stark ambience to fast-paced techno, all while feeling consistent in relation to the events that are taking place. All elements of sound here are undeniably great, with all the voice acting too being some of the best you would have heard for the time. GTA 3 comes close, but there's a style here that makes every character individualized and memorable. The most obvious example of course being Max himself, with his bassy and stern delivery being unmistakable.
Apart from his suspicious food habits, I figured Bravura to be one of the good guys. Fate had just dropped us on different sides in this. But when it came to capturing me, he was way out of his league. I had already ditched the cops a couple of rooftops back. For now,
Coming towards the end of the game, we get some of the most impressive visuals and chaotic levels, but at the same time, some more annoying platforming segments which I think simply didn't need to be here. There's this strange tendency towards the finish line to put in these trip mines, which to me only seem to waste time. They're so obvious and easy to bypass that I don't know why they were put in. I'd understand if they tripped the player up in some way, and required them to find an alternate path forward, but you literally either walk right past them or blow them up. In fact, there's a part in the final mission where you've got to carefully navigate through these laser beams, working far more effectively, but losing its uniqueness due to the frequent trip mines we've already had to go through. This final mission is fairly intense, featuring a nice wide open building with good combat encounters, like the elevated men with grenade launchers at the start, but on top of wrapping things up quite nicely in a story sense, as well as setting up events for the future like the character Mona getting shot in the head, and Woden becoming our ally. I think the finale of this game is rather lackluster. Throughout the game, we've seen several encounters akin to a boss fight, which I think is a weird decision for the type of game this is. The Gognity chase was fine, and although I'd still say it's a boss fight in some proportion, as it's all based around getting to him through several obstacles, I can see if some people wouldn't want to classify it as one. But the fights against Lupino, Boris Dime, and Frankie Niagara stood out as being strange to me. Lupino barely gets away with it due to being described as amped up on V, but the other two take a ridiculous amount of damage despite having no body armor, and also can destroy you in half a second. This means the encounter will either result in you getting annoyed at how ridiculous and unfair it is that this sole person can survive an onslaught for some reason, but even if it doesn't give you trouble, it just looks insane the amount of times you shoot them, and they don't show any signs of being injured, simply getting trapped in a stun lock. For a game that's all about disposing a large array of enemies with ease, bosses like this just don't work for me. They stand out as moments that are more awkward, and in the case of someone like Boris Dime, you hardly even know the character, so it's just stuck in my mind as the moment where one enemy has a really large amount of health for no reason. But I'd say the one boss fight they somewhat get away with is the final one, as it's played out more in the context of a puzzle as opposed to getting raw damage off. I still don't think it's great. In fact, I think there's several moments earlier in the mission that would have been far more interesting if played out as a final encounter, but there's a good sense of build up because of these moments, with the helicopter becoming an overarching threat, making the player somewhat despise the constant issues it ends up bringing. My only issue is of course how deflating I think it is overall. It might be satisfying in a story sense with us finally taking down Nicole Horn, but it simply consists of us shooting down a pole for it to land on the helicopter. If they were going for some kind of puzzle, they should have at least made it slightly more involved on the player's part, as well as not having the solution be blatantly obvious right from the start. But all those criticisms aside, that takes us to the end of Max Payne 1. It's an interesting game to look back on, as despite it definitely being a hugely influential and revolutionary title, I've got to say there's elements of this which haven't aged too well. The combat is still some of the most satisfying I've experienced from a shooter, arguably ever, so much so that it would keep me playing even if that's all the game had to offer. But there's so much stuff on top of that, like the story, the themes, and the characters, which makes this game feel like a grand journey instead of an aimless gameplay loop. There's such a distinct personality to this game, and much like most pieces of art that are fearlessly innovative, that also means I wouldn't define it as perfect, similar to games like GTA 3. Whereas the future games become far more refined, what we see here is a collage of ideas built upon a very solid foundation, and as we go forward, we'll eventually see how Remedy end up identifying all of the possible strengths that would end up resulting in what I consider to be their masterpiece. The reception to Max Payne 1 was overwhelmingly positive from both players and critics, with elements which I mentioned like the game's story, atmosphere and combat being highly praised. Some parts like the graphics were rather mixed, with the overall art design and fidelity of the world still being looked at positively. But aspects like the character models, and especially the faces, were not looked at so good, and I can't blame them. For a brand new IP, sales were also unexpectedly high, selling around 82,000 copies in its first month. But all the hard work paid off immensely, ending up in the game grabbing numerous accolades, even snagging a BAFTA for Best PC Game. So you could only assume with all these positive returns, it was only natural that Remedy tried their hand at the series once again, reflecting on their first experience and attempting to refine it to the point of perfection. And all things considered, I think they actually managed to pull it off in this sequel. Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne, released on the 14th of October 2003, only 2 years after the first game. During the development of this game, several key decisions were made in relation to the game's combat, story and engines that were vital towards the several significant upgrades from the first experience. Let's hop straight in and start witnessing these for ourselves. First of which is obviously the game's theme, easily being one of my favourite pieces of music in any game, period. it immediately presents a far darker tone than the original, but at the same time brings a majesticness and large air of mystery, with the sweeping strings and low bass hits being fantastic. From this title screen, as well as the opening cutscene, you'll also notice Max's appearance has significantly changed, now resembling James McCaffrey far more than Sam Lake, both of which return to their respective voice and writing roles here. The opening cutscene also made me realise how much better McCaffrey's delivery is in this game.
The past is a gaping hole. You try to run from it. The more you run, the deeper, more terrible it grows behind you, its edges yawning at your heels.
Excluding the obvious negatives like some of the screams in the first game, the bassy drone of his voice made it so that he'd sometimes get stuck in this loop of sounding literally exactly the same, with there being no real emotion at points. And hey, I definitely know how hard it is to read off lines, I'm still not very good at it, but I'm also not what you'd call a voice actor, so it's great to see this time round the performance has somehow become even more top-notch than it already was. I love how this game essentially picks up right where we left off. We of course get the flash forward at the beginning, where we're informed that characters like Mona, who only played a bit part in the previous game, are now going to be a sole focus. But after the first level, where we witness some other events that are going to play out in the future, we're taken right back to the previous night, where Max explains that after Woden got him off the hook in relation to the whole Nicole Horn and Valkyr situation, he went back to working at the NYPD. Let's not skip over this first level though, as it's a fantastically trippy way to kick off this game, leaving the player with even more intrigue into how this game's going to play out, while geniusly showing them exactly what's going to play out while still having it be a shock later on. With Max being battered, bruised and drugged up, the game basically starts with a nightmare sequence, a part of these games which is taken far more advantage of than the previous game, which, despite perhaps not being as genuinely freaky at points, has a wider variety of things to witness. The presentation is a lot more cinematic, with there being a considerable amount of in-game cutscenes, which thankfully fixed that issue I had in relation to the clues in the first game taking us out of the action too frequently. And these are just so well done too, not being as awkward as they once were, but having a genuinely sleek style to them with some really well directed moments, which get even further amplified by some of the strange effects that are constantly on screen. It once again puts us in the head of Max. We're not just observing these events from a distance, but experiencing these effects along with Max, bringing us even closer to his character. As you could see, the graphic novel cutscenes also make a return, looking just as stylish as before, and in fact I'd say across the board there's certain moments which are just drop dead gorgeous, with the art direction being a very clear priority in relation to the environments and most of the characters this time round. This second mission is where we're taken back to Max's time at the NYPD, with this apparent odd job eventually ending up in him getting met with figures from the past, which starts yet another journey filled with bullets, blood and heartbreaks. But it does give us a good opportunity to look at some of the gameplay changes, so we'll focus on the series' USP first. Bullet time is back and better than it's ever been. We still have that hourglass in the bottom left corner, along with our health bar, both of which just have a slight amount more detail to make them appear even more distinctive. But when actually using bullet time, you'll notice Max's movement speed has been increased, as well as how fast he's shooting out bullets. I'm pretty sure the base movement is much faster anyway, but as you get more kills while using bullet time, the hourglass will start turning yellow. This makes it so that you're moving even closer to your standard speed, while at the same time making everything around you slow down even more. This speeds up the pace immensely and makes for a way more satisfying experience. It's elements like this which have made this game infinitely replayable for me. It made me realise that even the slightest thing like some clunky movement or dodgy gameplay scenarios can possibly destroy what was otherwise a very smooth gameplay experience, which is not seen in this game at all. The yellow hourglass doesn't just have the effect of making you faster though, but upon getting enough kills, it features single-handedly the coolest reload animation ever. I'm not entirely sure if it has any useful effect outside the visual aspect, as I've never felt any kind of invincibility frames while doing this, but that really doesn't matter. It's a clear indication that we're in safe hands here. The devs seem to tap into exactly what players enjoyed and wanted more of from the first game. I will say though, coolness aside, I think the bullet time here makes the game considerably easier, not just from the stuff I just mentioned, but also the fact it's now fully segmented from the shoot dodging. Whereas before, the diving and standard bullet time were weaved into a combo. Now when diving, you still get the same slowed down effect, but without losing any time off your hourglass. It's definitely a change, but it's just sort of nothing. I never felt starved of bullet time, even in the hardest difficulties. And ultimately, if people are having a hard time, it at least makes the game slightly more accessible by not leaving them with nothing. The dodging itself is majorly improved, as although it still serves essentially the exact same function, it addresses the height and distance issues I had. This time, launching a fair distance in the air so you can get your shots off, while pushing you even further in a certain direction to hopefully avoid damage. This was a genuine issue for me in the first game, with too many instances where I was trying to get get a shot off while dodging behind a table or desk, but simply couldn't because Max was basically sliding on the floor. There's also the addition of being able to prolong Max from getting up in exchange for consistent shooting while on the ground. This makes diving far less risky in most cases, as you no longer need to time your jumps as carefully due to the fact you'll still be able to get yourself out of a scrape. I think it's for the best, as despite me actually enjoying that risk-reward element, it's a more functional inclusion, and once again presents more of a flow compared to any kind of stunted experience. Everything about bullet time this time round is refined to the point of perfection. It's fast, slick, and stylish, with even minor inclusions like the slight yellowish tint which gets applied when activating it, working effectively to make your ability seem impactful, but still grounded in reality. We eventually get reintroduced to Mona here, which is where the story really starts.
Mona?
Max, we gotta stop meeting like this.
Unlike the last game, which was very scatterbrained in the things it wanted to focus on, Max Payne 2's concise in its approach to the narrative, still wearing its influences on its sleeve, but having all these elements coalesce into a cohesive story, compared to the last game where too much stuff was simply references to themes that didn't mean that much in the grand scheme of things. It states clearly on the game's cover what it's going for, a film noir love story. I think it's a mark of a great writer to instead refine and pare down the story into something much more understandable and satisfying, as opposed to going even more broad and grand for a game that I think doesn't really warrant that approach. In turn, the game ends up being a much more sentimental and emotional ride than previously, focusing even more on Max's mindset and arguably making him and Mona the pinnacle of the game's story. Although I say that, it's not like outside factors such as our overarching enemies are ignored. Everything works so well here that it's hard to pick out any parts of this narrative that seem irrelevant or underdeveloped. On top of Mona, we also see other characters brought back like our ally Vlad and the mobster Vinny Gognitti. This works well in making those characters more defined and making the universe of Max Payne feel even more believable and realistic. We meet them in the second mission, heading back to the Ragnarok Club, which has now been taken over by Vlad. The visuals of this game are impeccable from top to bottom. No more weird, uncanny faces, but instead a much higher fidelity and wider variety of environments to explore. Other games in 2003 showed some great art direction. Games like Wind Waker and Sonic Heroes had these brilliantly colourful worlds that just popped. But outside of perhaps Silent Hill 3, which was bordering a PS3 game with how great that looked, Max Payne 2 was about the best you were going to get if you wanted a dark and realistic looking world. All the textures, including the character models, buildings, and weapons, of course have higher resolutions and clarity. The most noticeable change, as I mentioned, will be the faces. Now actually looking normal, even if they do still appear somewhat static when taking damage and talking. No matter where you are, the game's constantly conveying this sense of decay in the environments. There's rarely a moment where you aren't seeing paint peeling off walls, tiles being cluttered with dirt and grime, and rusty metal foundations looking like they're about to fall apart. Every area feels totally lived in and has a sense of age which reinforces the game's gritty atmosphere. Not to mention that in all of these areas, from your torn up apartment complex to the slightly snazzier hotel we visit later on, there's a surprisingly large number of interiors that we can enter inside these buildings, most of which we're guided to and are mandatory to enter to progress, but also being a fair amount of optional ones you can enter, which typically reward you with some kind of ammo or healing. We still have the standout features from the first game like the smoke and bullet effects, but these of course have been refined too, with the particle effects we see implemented here appearing a lot more subtle. Smoke doesn't bellow out of guns like it did in the last game, but it's almost like the first time round they were experimenting and actively showing off this part, but now have made these effects more nuanced and realistic. I think the biggest switch up is the brand new Havoc physics engine which was employed in this game, elevating pretty much every combat scenario to create something even more intense. Physics engines are typically employed in games to give a realistic sense of gravity in both the objects and characters. The most well-known physics effects would be part of engines like Source, with the term ragdoll frequently being used to describe the procedural nature these animations are presented in. When killing enemies, their bodies now go limp, and although it's definitely satisfying to witness this, I will say, when observing closer, the way they can oftentimes fly into the air and get propelled in a certain direction is admittedly pretty goofy for the kind of game this is. But as I said, this applies to everything. Boxes now won't spontaneously combust when hitting or shooting them, but instead will get toppled over and flung around. Weapons and painkillers dropped by enemies will bounce and flip around, depending on where the enemy was positioned when dying, and all the different kinds of debris like soda cans, paint cans, bins, and the numerous bullet casings that will be shooting out of weapons all adhere to this physics engine, feeling very authentic. The game just looks fantastic, both in a technical sense and artistic sense. There's never a moment where I'm thinking my surroundings seem too familiar to a previous level, and the re-addition of things like the TV shows on billboards that we frequently see, once again makes this universe feel alive, even if we're not actually given the chance to explore anywhere outside these levels. Due to this game being on rotation my entire life, it's the subtleties which I appreciate most. like all the different outcomes we see from shooting different surfaces, Max's iconic leather jacket being given even more detail with the creases we see, as well as how it sways around as we move. And although a large amount of character models do end up getting reused quite frequently here, which is definitely not ideal, it does result in even the most minor characters like the Hobo and Viola undeniably stick in my mind. I'm not denying the fact that I've played this game for so long that of course I'm going to know everything from back to front, but I'd say the majority of things here are fairly striking. Wide open construction sites, abandoned funhouses, men dressed up in blindingly white suits and mascot attire. Whereas the first game still looked great, there were elements that could be attributed to any game of its genre, whereas Max Payne 2 is easily one of the most visually stunning games in relation to how thought out every aspect seems to be. In terms of the game's level design, there's a definite push in the direction of feeling more open, which can be seen most clearly in levels like the apartment complex, the construction site, and also when going out on the streets with a mob war. As I said while looking at the first game, it's definitely refreshing to finally be playing a linear game for once. I actually think this headfirst dive into open worlds that we see now is such a childish way to create games. The opportunities for content are broader, of course. I can totally see why someone like Kojima would say that he'd only ever want to make open world games going forward, even though I doubt that philosophy will stick forever. But whereas I do love Death Stranding and can appreciate exactly why that game had to be open, there's so many others where it's just bizarre. The recent Sonic game, for example, despite looking like a tech demo in every single piece of footage I've seen, is just strange. You can literally imagine their thought process, looking at the current trends in video games and attempting to apply them to a series that's never really needed that stuff. Point is, I think the restrictions games once had to deal with oftentimes led to better game experiences, and what we see here is a game that's hyper-focused in simply trying to expand on what was already there. And as you could assume, it's great across the board, but funny enough, my one nitpick for this entire game does come from that Mob Wars mission. It's admittedly tiny, but the game breaks its rule of having these flat grey doors be primarily inaccessible, which makes the opening part of this level a bit convoluted to navigate at points. Outside of that though, we've got levels which still gives the player freedom to explore, while at the same time never letting them go so far off the beaten path they end up getting lost. The abandoned funhouse might be my favourite, as it's a mission that quite literally features no combat, so it's relying on its intriguing visuals and Max's narration alone. But even then, it's infinitely entertaining to me. I love all these cheesy depictions of things you'd see in actual haunted houses, and the soundtrack is perfect in giving a sense of unease. Enemy encounters are basically handled the same way. They're either minding their own business until you start shooting, or waiting for you to bust in through a certain entrance. All their placements are of course set, but height is utilised even more effectively in certain moments to force the player to keep full attention on the combat. There are some moments which are slightly annoying, like when the enemies are almost entirely obscured through grated pathways, and specifically in the construction site there's moments where they're a bit too difficult to even get a shot on, but those are minor inconveniences in the otherwise solid enemy placement. Just because this verticality's used though, doesn't mean platforming's implemented anywhere near as much. It was a weird inclusion in the first game, and although it's not completely gone, it's definitely toned down significantly here. It's not that navigating your way forward is dampened to any degree, it's just that like everything else, there's a constant forward motion which is rarely broken. I love how certain levels either adapt to your destruction or change over time when revisiting them, which happens in a few levels here. Max's side of the construction site ends off with a bombastic dash out of the building, while it explodes around us, with there being multiple moments where both new paths get opened for you through walls, floors and ceilings, but also moments where you've got to blow these up yourself using surrounding explosives. These explosives are another element which are utilised more effectively here, with these red barrels and smaller green ones being placed frequently in the combat arena to blow enemies away. The thing I hold in highest esteem is simply how all these sections are crafted with the intention to let the player live out their action fantasy. We'll get into the combat and weapons in a sec, but even when looking at things like Max's bullet time reload, there's a real sense of this angelicness and freedom to all the chaos you're causing. So many options are on the table to how you can carry out a certain attack, made even better by the much improved AI, something we'll also talk about in a sec. The levels also experiment around with brand new ideas often, letting us experience events from two different points of view, seeing what it'd be like to have allies fighting alongside you. And it even has a full-blown escort mission, which unlike most of its contemporaries, ends up being one of my favourite moments in the game. To sum up, levels in this game are considered, constantly evolving, and most definitely show how the developers reflected on their past work and tried to improve upon it tenfold. Combat here is the fastest and most visceral it's been, which is primarily down to both your overall increased speed and how the enemies have been programmed to respond to it. Primarily due to the bullet time, I found myself taking a greater amount of risks here, and in turn it made me realise the balance between you and the enemies is nigh on perfect. This time round the shooting is so much better, and there were far less inconsistencies in relation to damage outputs. Never was there a moment where I thought I should have killed someone but didn't, and to add to that, there was also not one single moment that felt stunted. Enemy behaviour now has a realism to it, with enemies now very rarely employing the approach of darting straight at you. Instead, self-preservation seems to be their key priority, which is something I've always noticed ends up resulting in an AI system that gets heavily praised. It seems that when they act believably as a human as opposed to a robot, players can recognise that the combat encounter encounters are actually enhanced, which isn't an obvious outcome as it definitely creates more problems for the players themselves due to a new degree of uncertainty in these encounters. We still get that great thing from the first game where all these thugs are humanized somewhat, being able to hear their random conversations before you start opening fire.
Find them, kill them, the cop and the killer bitch. Hey, what the hell? Ah!
But even a tiny element like this has been recognized as important by the devs, with these being expanded to feature several unique moments where you'll see thugs dancing around or playing piano. It's not a game that I'd ever say tries to make you question the violence you're causing. Aside from being put up against solely criminals, the amount of times they call you a coward in this game alone deserves a bullet in the head. It's an element that might pop into the players' minds though because of this humanization, making you question how far Max is willing to go to get what he wants, and how ruthless and borderline psychotic the man must be to continue this overwhelming path of violence. Much like the player, he must be enjoying it to a certain degree. In combat, you'll notice that enemies will more often than not be moving backwards if you're charging ahead. You can bait these guys out if you want to be extra cheesy, but I think the game definitely encourages you to dive headfirst into these encounters. Their aim is now consistently accurate, which makes me realize how much better this approach is compared to previously, due to the fact that if you're constantly taking damage, you're also constantly being reminded of elements like your positioning and how you're approaching these encounters. The striking and rapid red flash whenever you get hit reminds the player to be more careful in the future and enter these fights with more consideration for your actions. Overall, the damage outputs from enemies is much less lethal. You're still fairly fragile, you can't tank a significant amount of damage, but I definitely found myself being more conservative and careful in the first game, as I didn't know if I was going to be able to survive the fights, as well as if I'd be able to survive any of the upcoming ones. There's definitely a trade-off between the enemy's accuracy and their damage, which I think works perfectly, as I imagine if enemies doubt out the damage of the first game, I'd find a few moments just a tad too frustrating. There's a clear jump towards making the gameplay accessible to newer players, but the one inclusion I don't really like is how the game ends up adapting if you're finding a certain part difficult. If you die too many times at a certain point, the enemies are made less effective, and you may also be given additional healing alongside this. I could appreciate this if they asked you beforehand if you wanted help, but I never like the idea of games making these kinds of decisions by itself, as the game not only has 3 set difficulty options to begin with, but I'm sure many people won't actually want assistance. And then of course there's Max himself, which aside from the bullet time has seen a drastic improvement in relation to all aspects of movement and shooting. I didn't really mind how he moved in the first game, but it always looked very robotic to me. His strides in any given direction looked and felt quite stiff. Here though, Max controls smoothly, which as we see in the apartments makes any kind of platforming far less clunky. It's just the fact the game strays away from that anyway. The weapons are still broad and varied in their functions, but additional ones have been added to each individual weapon class like the Kalashnikov and MP5, that geniusly still switch things up from previously. It was somewhat of a criticism in the GTA games, where I said although the bigger arsenal was an overall positive, the weapons end up acting so similar that aside from the fresh appearance, there's no functional benefit from using one weapon over another. Here though, due to some of these weapons' attachments, as well as the return of a prescient concern over ammo conservation, every weapon still serves its own purpose. The MP5, for example, is an alternative to the Ingrams, which, despite having a lower fire rate and not being able to dual wield the weapon, instead has a scope, letting you pick off targets from further away, as well as what feels like a higher damage output. The Kalashnikov serves as an alternate to the Commando, now called the M4, and although the distinction here is less noticeable, the Kalashnikov is a weapon you'll be finding on enemies more often, but lacks the perfect accuracy of the M4, although I'm not sure that's a huge issue considering how you're more accurate in general here. You're still able to carry every single weapon you find, as well as holding up to 8 painkillers and also throwables. The throwables have now been binded to a different key, which means that you don't have to pull these out separately from your other weapons, simply making these more functional, and in turn made me utilize the throwables in several occasions, as it doesn't slow you down or put you at a risk anymore. Melee is still wholly irrelevant in a game like this, but it's not a big deal, and I suppose could potentially get you out of a close encounter. I haven't even mentioned it so far, but when you think about it, the healing in this game is just bizarre. Aside from obviously referring to the pain part of Max's name, the way you regain health is by eating painkillers. The way the healing actually works in both games is identical, but definitely interesting. When eating these, it doesn't present a static health boost, but instead will start a slow cooldown until you eventually regain your lost health. This means that you've got to consider your actions even more in these firefights, as if you take too much damage in the middle of one, you're still likely not going to make it out alive. In general, combat here is absolutely top notch, and excluding Max Payne 3, which takes a substantially different approach, I think Max Payne 2 might still be the best shooter I've personally ever played. played. If you're playing well, you can feel like an untouchable god, but can be brought down from that feeling quite rapidly if you aren't also paying attention. It presents a refinement to everything we saw the first time round. Bullets now appear even more distinct and stylish in bullet time. Every weapon's appearance looks great. The way enemies fling around, not just when being killed, but when you dive into them and open doors in front of them, is hilariously satisfying. It's brilliant stuff all round, and I'd say flawless. I think the biggest criticisms I saw were in relation to the game's length, which I somewhat understand, but also due to how tightly designed everything is. The replayability ultimately makes that criticism almost completely void for me. It's undeniable that the game is short, which is quite strange for a sequel in the first place, but I'm almost definite that it's shorter than the first game, which is even weirder. The fact is though, everything we see is so fantastic that it's got to be intentional. It's blatant to see Remedy are brimming with creativity, so trying to imply they were either running out of ideas or couldn't come up with new stuff is just insane. They've seemingly cherry-picked only the very best ideas they put on the table, which might have resulted in a shorter experience, but one that's remained timeless. Not to mention that replayability is very clearly an emphasis this time round, with different modes getting unlocked after you complete each difficulty setting, with the most difficult one actually having an entirely alternate ending. Talking of the story, this is one that's steeped in feelings of loss, revenge, inadequacy, and fear. As I said, it's still basically all about Max, but has this emphasis on his romance with the character Mona. The cutscenes mainly convey their development between each other, but it's also done well in a gameplay sense, with there being a few times throughout the game where we switch into Mona's perspective. The best example of this is obviously the construction site, with us first going through as Max, while also hearing dialogue from Mona through our earpiece.
Hardcore professionals.
Doesn't seem that way from where I'm standing.
What's that supposed to mean?
And then re-witnessing these events through her perspective, letting us explore different parts of the area that Max was separated from, and cleverly making some of her initially confusing lines make sense.
Doesn't seem that way from where I'm standing.
This is why I still think it's all ultimately about Max though, and not their relationship, as everything in Mona's segments are simply done to prop up how much she, and in turn we, care about Max's character, whether it be defending him from an onslaught of thugs, or diving into some burning wreckage to go save him. It's still all about Max. But outside of that, the way everything comes together here has such an excellent pace to it, whereas before, the nightmare sections were the only break we'd really get. Now we get moments like the prologues of chapters 2 and 3, the first of which is an immersive reconstruction of a police station, letting us walk around and hear a surprising amount of unique interactions between several people, some of which I'd never even heard before while recording. Then in chapter 3, you experience a genuinely tense and for me, scary moment where you're completely unarmed but are trapped inside a room by a guard, which eventually leads to us bursting out and having to run away as the guy chases after you. Although the second one is more impressive when observing the gameplay, the police station is a fantastic chance to soak in the atmosphere, understand better the kinds of people that are working around Max, and of course to gain further insight on characters like Mona and Winterson. It's primarily a solid narrative about Max settling his scores with characters like Vlad, who's eventually revealed to be the villain of this game. There are subtleties that I observed this time round though, which really took me aback at points. A good example is in the police station once again, where upon entering a certain room, we see a projection of Max's dead body on a screen. This alone was incredibly interesting to me, as it brings up that unreliable narrator idea. There's no way for this to be real. It has to be a hallucination inside Max's head, which brings into question how many other things we've witnessed, which may have just been hallucinations, which is reinforced even further when we end up seeing this exact scenario inside of a nightmare later on. Antagonists like Vlad and Winterson are fantastic, with their switch to the opposite side of you not being conveyed as some kind of twist, despite it being somewhat surprising, but has this matter-of-factness to it which I very much enjoyed. It also has the great feature of any mystery, where they lay down several clues along the way for the player to ponder on, before then either shocking them or confirming their suspicions. The nightmares are still easily the most memorable parts here for me, with moments like the maze of mirrors being overlooked by a blood-red sky, and the several different Maxes we see inside of cages being amazing. It's uncompromisingly surreal, while also quite clearly letting us in on how Max's mindset is ticking over. The TVs are used especially effectively in the final one, letting us witness certain events which we don't initially see. The TVs in general here are great though too, this time having shows like Lords and Ladies, Address Unknown, and Dick Justice, which is a reference to one of Max Payne's working titles, that being Dark Justice, which I mentioned earlier. All of which are also reflective of the game's events, still being very Twin Peaks in their approach.
Were you looking for me by chance?
My lord, I was... Oh, this is so difficult.
The dialogue here is impeccable too. I have no idea how any reviewers see this stuff as cheesy in any way. To me, it just seems like it has a very set style, while obviously paying homage to some of its influences. I'd say a lot of the moments here are borderline quotable, especially some of Vlad's lines.
You saved my life! I could kiss you!
Fraternizing with the enemy, I had stepped over the edge. The cartoon moment when the gravity waits for the coyote to realize his mistake before the plunge.
Bang! You're dead, Max Payne.
The story has a defined beginning, middle, and end. It's not trying anything too unconventional in that sense. It's how the events are played out in an unchronological fashion though, which do make them even more interesting and amplify the mystery aspect. The sound of the game is not substantially different from what we saw the first time. Weapons all have different sound effects of course, and aside from what sounds like overall higher quality audio files, I simply enjoy how each individual weapon sounds a lot more. The Berettas have a snappiness and bite to them. The shotguns have a ground-shaking pop.
But the cleaners were slipping away, making a run for it.
And both assault rifles sound ferociously rapid and dangerous. There's rarely, if ever, a moment in this game when it's not raining, and due to you spending most of your time inside structures, you're constantly hearing this rain hitting on the rooftops. Like usual, the ambience always tends to feature a soundscape of distant traffic and hollow winds, but we're now also frequently hearing cracks of thunder, and in the nightmares there's a constant swaying background drone that's both mesmerizing and horrifying at the same time. The music plays a more prominent role here, as since we spend more time inside, we're not getting to experience some of the rich ambience of the first game. Once again, this soundtrack does not falter in any aspect though. It's got a similar tone to what we heard previously, but like everything, it's been amplified to make the intense moments even more intense, and the freaky moments even freakier. There's several themes which crop up frequently that will just inevitably get stuck in your head, and much like the main theme, there's a definite orchestral feel to these tracks, which makes the inclusion of the drum and bass elements even more fantastic. It's still conveying a dark and mysterious atmosphere, while also straying into more emotional and heartfelt pieces. To wrap up, I think we should look at the bosses of this game, or the lack thereof. I'm glad these are basically completely absent this time round. Their inclusion in the first game was very weird to me. The only bosses we really have here are Kaufman and Vlad, and Kaufman barely counts. It's one of the strangest moments, as we don't really hear anything substantial about this guy before or after this. He just shows up in the hotel and gets introduced like a main character before immediately getting gunned down by us. He's not even hard to kill, he goes down like any other enemy really. Of course though, the main boss of the game is Vlad. We're after storming Woden's manor in the final mission, which by the way features some incredible moments of destruction, like having the ceiling explode on top of us, and having the entire wine cellar be obliterated, as well as obviously Max's heart when Mona gets killed. We end up fighting against Vlad in yet another puzzle-based boss battle. This one though is even easier than the final boss fight of the last game, which for me made it feel even more lackluster. Which is a shame, because Vlad is an amazing villain. As opposed to Nicole Horn, he both betrays you, taunts you, and shoots Max in the head throughout the course of this game. He deserved a better cap-off, but instead all we do is shoot down this huge structure onto the platform he's standing on, and then just kill him. I always try to give writers a pass on this front, as making the big bad villain's death comparable to the hundreds of men you've just killed has a poignancy in its own right, making them an equal and not anything special. But it just doesn't fit the tone here for me, and admittedly, Vlad does prove himself to be a far more dominant figure compared to anyone else around him. And that's Max Payne 2, one of my favourite games of all time, that presents an entirely different style of story, while leaving all of its gameplay ideas and the tone of the first game intact. Everything's presented with even more flair. The improvements are all noticeable, and it's an experience that, while relatively short, is precise in its execution. Much like a good movie tends to do, it lets you immerse yourself into its world, but doesn't overstay its welcome. It features gameplay ideas they want you to experience and storylines they want to let play out, but never does it feel like things are being dragged out for the sake of it. There's never periods where you're aimlessly going along with what's being presented to you. It draws you in and basically never lets go until you're done. The strangest part of all of this though is easily what happened when the game came out. Despite the first game being such a celebrated and popular title, although the second game was praised even higher than the first, it got nowhere near the same recognition. Max Payne 2 sales were described as disappointing by Take-Two, the company which owns Rockstar, which I'm sure was one of the main reasons Max Payne was put on the back burner for a long time. Although, judging by Remedy's future work, it seemed they were pretty much done with the series anyway. Max Payne 2 is about as perfect a finale as you could get for Max's story. Much like the game itself, I don't doubt that doing yet another game based in this dark noir tone might have led to some exhaustion, even for the biggest fans of the series. It was time to move on, and for several years it looked like the Max Payne series was completely done. It was only on September 14th, 2011 where the public got the first trailer to Max Payne 3. And to long-time fans of the series, a lot of the stuff that was included here would have been rather shocking. First off, Remedy was completely out, and instead the project was being handled by Rockstar Studios, a collective effort between several of Rockstar's studios while featuring prominent figures from the GTA franchise, like Leslie Benzies and Sam and Dan Houser. The graphics, despite looking great, were incredibly different to anything we'd seen before. Max Payne was a series that thrived off dark alleyways and decrepit buildings, whereas now it seemed we were diving headfirst into a blindingly sunny Sao Paulo, taking on private militaries and local gangs, instead of the mobsters we were previously accustomed to. And the biggest change was to Max's character himself, now sporting a completely shaven head, and noticeably missing his leather jacket. Everything seemed like it was going in such a different direction that it might have been interesting to new audiences, but also must have initially been incredibly polarizing to the pre-existing fanbase. In my eyes, it sets itself up to fail, which as we'll see, couldn't be further from the actuality of the game. At the time, this was by far Rockstar's biggest project in their entire history, similar to the approach LA Noire took. Of course, with that game not being created but assisted by Rockstar, the amount of research that was done to ensure a level of authenticity was seemingly so in depth, with Rockstar actually sending people out to Sao Paulo to observe and note down elements like the general environment, how the people acted, what the law enforcement was like, what weapons they were carrying. Just anything they could potentially apply to the game to make it feel realistic, they noted down. And when getting into the game, all of this effort can pretty much be reflected in the first 5 minutes.
Maybe I'd lost my self-respect, but it's back. I'm excited. Really. I really needed a new start.
This opening cutscene is not just one of the best openings Rockstar's ever created, but it proved immediately how loyal they were planning to be to the series' roots. They obviously recognise this is a series that means a lot to more than a few people, so starting the game off by focusing on Max's ever-decreasing mental state, as well as bringing back the iconic theme, this time sounding even more hollow and dark. It's letting the player know they're in safe hands, although this game doesn't make reference to a large amount of the events in the previous games, with most of these resulting simply as Easter eggs or small pieces of dialogue. I don't have an issue with that particularly. It is called Max Payne 3, but I understand why Rockstar would somewhat want to distance themselves from the past. If they're following their own separate vision, there's no need to go over things that have already been seen. Max as a character is still mainly consistent in what we've previously seen, with this new evolution of his character revealing a man that's utterly destroyed and broken, perfectly reflected in how we see him gorging on booze and painkillers, while sat crying holding a picture of his dead wife. I don't think Max was ever portrayed as truly stoic, at least not from our perspective, but we've never really seen him break down like this to the degree we see here. The game set up with the fact that Max needed a new start, being a good wink to the audience that what we're going to see is going to be quite a bit different from what we're used to, but also working in a story sense as we'll see later on. His crime fighting days at the NYPD are truly over, but he still needs money to survive, which eventually leads to him working as security for a family known as the Broncos. This stuff is kind of just thrown onto you, and it's done in a way which makes us feel somewhat lost but also curious. This is also done several times throughout the game, with us taking control of Max during a couple different periods of time, but the overall setup is that Max is now working in a country that he's not familiar with, surrounded by people that don't understand his language, all while having to bear the weight of potentially getting this rich and powerful family killed, in a city where people like them are firmly hated by those below them. So the first thing I want to focus on is the elements that are noticeably different right off the bat, and I suppose the first thing that anyone would notice are the cutscenes. The graphic novel style is completely gone. It's a big shame admittedly, as although this is likely what Remedy was trying to go for way back in the first game, they realised the graphic novel cutscenes not only cut their budget significantly, but they brought a uniqueness to a game that was already unique in the first place. Now with Rockstar's overwhelming budget of $105 million, still making it one of the most expensive games ever made, there's a clear jump in the direction of showing off all this hard work. What we get is still good. I never had an issue with any of the cutscenes, and after only a short amount of time, my yearning for the comic ones had dissipated. But I'm sure for a lot of players, it would have started the game with a sour taste in their mouth. They've all got a definite cinematic style. There's certain shots throughout the game that have been stuck in my mind endlessly, like this smooth transition between Max and Passos setting down to them riding a boat, or the shot at the start with the torn up Max standing over a guy who's bleeding out on the ground. The presentation may be different, but it's undeniably brilliant. That's aside from one thing that I think the game goes far too extreme on. You would have noticed that throughout all this footage there's constant effects flashing on the screen, which was off-putting to me straight away. Years ago when I played it for the first time, I thought it started off cool but then overstayed its welcome. Now I can appreciate what they've done more, trying to get you in Max's his head constantly, which is definitely something I noticed the previous games trying to do at points. If you find it disorientating, nauseating, and I suppose even annoying, then it's worked effectively. We're playing as Max, and I'm sure he doesn't like these effects either. I think I was still valid in my first playthroughs though, as it's the combination of both how often these come up on screen, as well as how they just don't stop for the game's entire length. I don't think the style's anywhere near as good as the graphic novels, and for me it comes down to one reason. They don't go far enough. There's too many instances where I think these cutscenes are actively being jeopardized by these effects, not enhanced. And I've got to mention it again, as it's undeniable here. The game quite clearly has taken inspiration from Kane and Lynch 2, but in that game's case I feel the opposite way, loving the game's style but not liking the combat. In that game, the camera was so shaky at points you could barely figure out what was going on, and there was such a grit to that game which I was genuinely impressed with. It's not a masterpiece to me, but easily one of the strangest and most experimental shooters I've ever played. There's just not many things quite like it. Max Payne 3 tries to apply that grittiness here, but with a budget as big as the one they have, the sheer quality is going to be unavoidable, thus dampening the effect for me. Overall, cutscenes are fine though. They all look fantastic, and although I feel like particular ones drag on a bit, an issue which is made even worse due to the fact that some of these are secretly unskippable as the game says it's still loading. They still convey all the information and plot points in a more stylized way than your typical shooter. Of course, our first day on the job goes wrong, which is basically all we see from Max here. A series of screw-ups that leads him further down a confusing rabbit hole, where he eventually ends up questioning why he's doing the things he does. It's an interesting setup. It changes Max's ruthless tirades into a job, whereas before they were all based upon his own emotional connection to characters like Mona. These opening stages work on a great cycle which connects us deeper to Max's character. While in public, despite still being seen guzzling down whiskey whenever he gets a chance, he's still seen as a level-headed individual, and not to mention his incredible combat skills. But then, when taking us back to his lonely apartment, we see him do nothing but drink booze and swallow down painkillers, something which interestingly has now become an addiction. Even outside the healing aspect, Max can't help himself but take these things, something which, if you think about it, we've actually got him addicted to, due to our frequent popping of them in the other two games. Max Payne's MO has always been its combat, and with a different studio taking over the reins, we can't ignore it for any longer than we already have. And to ease any tension, Rockstar seems to have a very clear, and maybe even better understanding of how to handle this John Woo style combat, while also applying some realistic elements to it without feeling like a burden. That's not discrediting Remedy, obviously. They laid the foundations so that Rockstar could perfect them, but that is genuinely what they do here. Max Payne 3 isn't just up there with one of my favourite games, but it could possibly be my favourite shooter ever. Now, Max's overall movement here is the slowest it's ever been. Running around, diving, going upstairs and shooting all has this added weight to it, which as you could assume is because of elements like Max's age and well-being. Even though I don't think he looks significantly older than what we saw in the first two games, the idea of him being an old man that's way past his prime is instilled from the start. This means that although bullet time and shoot dodging returns, they've been revamped to cater to this approach. Bullet time has now returned to being a much slower process. The more enemies you kill doesn't result in you speeding up to the insane degree you did in 2. The health bar and adrenaline meter has been switched to the right hand side now, and it's a bit of a shame they lack the detail the previous UIs did, but that's very minor. Instead of the hourglass, we just get a bar, and as usual, the more it gets filled up, the longer you'll have in bullet time. However, we've gone back to how it functions in the first game, with diving and manually activating it both using it up. Although even when there's nothing in the meter, you can still dive, which is somewhat confusing, as I'm not sure what the purpose of using it up while diving even does then. Perhaps it makes things even slower, or maybe prolongs the dive. The change is so minimal in that case that I'm not entirely sure, and resulted in me having to use the dive far more this time, simply because there was never that much bullet time to use outside of that. That's fine, it's promoting a more stylish way of taking out your enemies, but the dive is something I think is both great, but not perfect for a lot of these levels. You can really feel the impact of Max launching into the air and landing this time round. You can both witness him make small run-ups to dives instead of launching into them, and you'll also hear Max audibly let out groans and shouts while landing. I think this is the most blatant they get when representing Max's old dog status here. There's no more agile dives, where Max kicks himself up immediately afterwards. Once you're on the ground, Max won't move until you do. He'll just lie there until you make him slowly pick himself back up. It's fantastic in a story sense, but works even more effectively as a gameplay one, by not forcing the player to pick themselves back up, while also giving them full accessibility to shoot while on the ground. We get a perfect blend between what we saw in the first and second game. Diving is now far riskier. If you time a jump wrong, you could leave yourself open to an absolute absolute onslaught. But at the same time, now that we're able to just lie on the floor, even letting us aim down our sights and turn all different directions, it also means you're not completely helpless. The biggest addition isn't really related to this, but is bullet time based, so I'm counting it. The painkiller system still works almost the exact same. You find them around the areas you explore and can pop them to regain your health back. This time though, for what I assume is a compensation for how intense some moments can get, there's no more cooldown, you get an immediate health boost. That's fine, although I assume most people who aren't playing the old school difficulty mode are going to be saving these up for a specific purpose. This new function's called Last Man Standing, where upon having all of your health depleted, you'll be launched into a final stand, where you're given a short amount of time to take out the enemy that killed you to be brought back. It's a great mechanic in itself, but there's also more things you can do within it, which makes it serve an even greater purpose. For example, while you're in this state, your aim will be automatically guided towards the guy that killed you, meaning you can move your aim around them, and perhaps take out some more enemies in the meantime. You've got to consider your ammo too, as if you were running low on bullets, you won't be given the opportunity to reload your weapon, which means that missing your shots could potentially result in you dying. A brilliant mechanic that I'm not sure absolutely had to be here, but the fact that it is will give struggling players a lifeline without making them restart from a checkpoint. And ultimately, I feel like it might have come as a result of some of the level design here, with several sections being very broad and open. The graphics, gore, and art design here remain some of my favourite of all time. It's easy to see none of the budget's gone to waste. The visuals are still astonishing today, although I'd say it lacks an overall style that made the original two games so memorable. They replaced that with several scenarios that instantly become the most standout moments in the series. Firefights taking place in favelas, nightclubs, and stadiums. It's such a different atmosphere from the series' noir roots, but at the same time, we do still get glimpses into that old style in the flashback sequences. The textures are top-notch across the board. There's not one thing I can pick out as looking even remotely bad. The weapons are all immensely detailed when observing them up close. The enemies are varied enough to where you may see some similar faces and clothing from time to time, but nowhere near as much as we once did. Even the clothing is something to be marveled at here, when considering how most enemies previously were all dressed up in either cleaner suits or special ops gear. Now there's tons of stuff they wear, all of which still correlates to the many different types of people you're fighting, going all the way from these Brazilian gangs to the police. Max himself looks visibly older, but in turn resembles James McCaffrey even closer, someone who I'd have to assume is the only returning character here, at the very least the only substantial one. I love details like how you can see Max's clothing creasing up while you run forward, and how in certain clothing you'll be able to see Max's sweat patches from the amount of action he's getting involved in. All the environments are shockingly beautiful, oftentimes in the most twisted way possible. The nightclub's bright neon lights and booming music makes the place feel authentic, which much like their research was attempting to do, conveys these areas in the most realistic way possible. The football stadium is a fantastic concept in itself, feeling even more fleshed out by the numerous details we can witness along the way, like having football shirts hung up on walls, a broadcasting room overlooking the field, and as we experience towards the end, a gigantic light rig which we use to dive in through a window. I'd say we get a greater focus on exteriors here. We still start off the game fighting primarily inside, with our encounters in the bar and the Broncos headquarters being standouts for me, particularly with the amount of glass breakage we see in the latter being brilliant. But having Max shave his hair off doesn't just serve as a transition to his character funnily, but also the levels. It's just as linear in terms of the level design, with this game arguably being the most restrictive in the series, something I think's a shame considering how great the world looks. The scale is broadened immensely though, which we can see right at the start of our journey into Sao Paulo's gang territory. They commit a cardinal sin in gaming where they purposely slow you down for a period of time, but I'll give it a pass here because of the fantastic visual. They knew how good this looked, or rather how immaculately shitty these ghettos look. It's moments like this which make you realise how close this game actually is to the previous ones, tone included. Despite the bright surroundings, that same claustrophobia is back in full force, and as opposed to the fear we would have had in relation to the previous game's darkness and mystery, now we've got a brand new fear, that being a fear of the unknown. Max even comments on what we're already thinking. He stands out like a sore thumb compared to everyone around him.
I was a dumb American in a place where dumb Americans were less popular than the clap. If I was gonna find my way out of this mess, I was on my own.
And as we eventually see, he ends up facing the repercussions of this.
All things considered, I was gonna have to look on this as a good outcome.
Whereas before, little details like cans exploding with liquid were notable, there's such a ridiculous amount of detail here, it's impossible to mention everything. Even in the opening hour of the game, we witness similar effects to that can, but out of nearby water pipes, something which is totally unnecessary, but all the more awesome when you witness it in a gunfight. With all this talk of the new environment, environments though, it's important to note that in the flashbacks, they essentially perfectly recapture the atmosphere of the other two games. Max is back with his leather jacket, Snowfall is back just like the first game, and although we aren't fighting through similar areas, the combat encounters that happen in the bar and graveyard are brilliant. The graveyard in particular seemed to be so liked by Rockstar that they basically recreated it in a mission for GTA 5. This game is inconceivably beautiful and unbelievably detailed. Everything that we mentioned before, like bullet holes accurately entering surfaces and having debris flying out, is just amped up to a whole nother level, with these destructive elements also now applying to the enemies, being able to see bullets go in and out of every single target. It's the polar opposite of what we saw before. Enemies used to shoot out blood but left no physical effects on the model. Now you can get these incredibly brutal close-ups of your enemies getting shot up, which is even better when you realise it's played out in slow-mo, and you can also keep firing lead into them as they go down. It's just an amazing looking game all round, and outside of the incessant visual effects, which I admit could potentially ruin the entire experience for certain players, there's almost no faults to be seen here. One difference here, which I think was almost unavoidable, was the dialogue.
Suddenly, things turned real ugly. Felt like our hangovers arrived right on cue.
This was one of the most noticeable elements to me, as taking away the graphic novel cutscenes was one thing, but then turning Max's attitudes completely on their head at points was strange, especially when playing these games back to back. Much like Sam Lake has a distinct style of writing, so does Dan Houser. I can recognise his dialogue from a mile away. Lake's was all based upon slick Tarantino-esque wisecracks and frequent metaphors, both subtle and blatant. The writers here make an attempt to recapture that style at points. There's some great one-liners and tons of quotable moments.
Jesus Christ, these bastards made the NYPD look like the Hare Krishnas.
It's just the fact I feel it's tonally inconsistent with the previous entries. I get the entire point was to switch things up and make it their own thing, but when you're putting 3 on the end, it implies there should still be consistency between this type of stuff, and especially staying consistent with Max's character, which I think is open to most criticism here. The performance is great as usual, but the writers for some reason can't help themselves from dropping expletives all over the place, something that Max completely stayed away from for the most part.
Haven't you figured out I don't speak your fucking language?
They had a fucking arsenal in here. It was time to bring this little hellhole to the ground.
There's so many F-bombs here that it just feels forced in my opinion. It would be normal for any other character, but not Max. I know you can argue that this could possibly reflect his jaded mindset, becoming more inappropriate and bitter due to how he's been worn down over the years. But to me, it just makes him sound more like a character from GTA at points. As I said though, that's not to say the dialogue is bad in any way. I think there's certain themes here which are arguably the most interesting in the series, even if they are removed from what it was once about.
Yes. Who has it in for our family? I mean, just because we are rich and happy, is that a good reason to hate us?
Rockstar's writers are clearly huge fans of satire. There always seems to be these kinds of lines in their projects to show the idiocy of certain people. And that's what I attach to here. I love the emphasis on classism, as it subtly brings all of our actions into question. Our job is to protect this incomprehensibly wealthy family. A job that Max took both for the money and also to escape a bad situation back in New York.
That looks about right.
It makes you realise that having this game set in Sao Paulo was a genius move for a number of reasons, and in the case of this rich family, it makes us realise that all of these people who are out to get them are simply revolting against what they perceive as this untouchable, cruel higher power. They're envious of their wealth, but for good reason. While the Broncos are sat up in their expensive headquarters and going out partying, the common person here is living in a dirty slum, living in constant fear of being robbed or killed. The dynamic becomes even more interesting due to how they flesh out the Broncos themselves.
I was mostly working for Rodrigo Bronco, a local businessman. Built things, did some charity, had things named after him, won awards, owned things, people.
With the head of the company, Rodrigo, being somewhat resentful of how he was born into wealth.
The men I talk to, they only see money, not my wife. I am not naive. She does not love me for my body.
Well, despite your good fortune, you're still a decent man.
Am I? I don't know. I try to be. But maybe I'm just another rich fool, just like the rest of my friends.
He's speaking from a place of privilege, obviously, but he at least shows himself to be aware of the position he's in. Whereas, as we just saw, his brother Marcelo actively looks down on those below him, frustrated that they get the slightest bit of flack for being a rich family in a poor city. I love the stories of the other two games, but for me, there's so many more real issues that are presented here that you can really get stuck into, having a poignancy in a real-world context. While you're gunning down all these gang members, you realise you're killing these poor guys to save some privileged kids who couldn't give a shit about them. No one here is in the right. everyone, including Max, is acting out of survival. He's got a job to do, so rich or poor, he's gonna kill anyone that tries to stop him. Which is possibly an even more concerning mindset. It's bordering psychopathy, with Max rarely showing any kind of emotion towards the huge amount of violence he causes. The one exception is when the police start getting involved, proving themselves to be an even deadlier and unyielding force than the gangs here. This leads us to discover this betrayal in the Bronco family, with the main antagonist becoming Rodrigo's brother Victor, who's been working with the police commando Armando Becker to create a conspiracy, resulting in Victor appearing like the best candidate for the upcoming election.
You disgusting piece of shit! I know everything! Not everything, my friend. Let go of him, Max. Huh? There's a good fellow. Well. Victor, I was wondering when you'd reappear out of whatever slimy hole you live in. I'd like to just say, Max, I just want to say thank you for all your hard work, for my family, and for cleaning up that horrible mess with the Crachá Preto for us. You know I'm tough on crime. I give you a bonus, but I think you just frittered it away.
By orchestrating the chaos that we see throughout the game and then cleaning it up, he'll appear like the city's saviour, which does lead to some pretty disturbing moments, like when we stumble across the organ harvesting base. That's the one occasion where Max blatantly shows his sympathy towards these tortured souls, putting any past grievances or current missions to the side, and letting the character Serrano, who initially was an antagonist that killed Rodrigo's wife Fabiana, slice into this organ harvester. I know this started off as a discussion of the dialogue, but as a story, I think the things it brings up are oftentimes more interesting than anything we saw previously. The tone might not be as strong. It looks great, but nowhere near as distinct. But upon closer inspection, there's so much to consider and dig into here that I can overlook the somewhat generic presentation at points. Back to the gameplay, what we see here has been totally modernized for the gaming landscape in 2013, with more emphasis being put on people playing with controllers on console and giving players as smooth an experience as possible. We saw the shooting mechanics before were very solid on PC, but we should also note that despite being seen as lesser versions, there were still console ports of Max Payne 1 and 2. These were fine, with the Xbox and PS2 versions being mostly untouched, apart from some slight visual downgrades, but the controls was where the game suffered somewhat, due to the slower and less precise aiming a controller offers compared to a mouse. Things like auto-aiming and lock-ons were employed to give players assistance. If players want to use these and actively enjoy using them, that's all good, but for me, this will never look like anything but a compromise from the core gameplay, and this is basically what we get in Max Payne 3 too, but of course including the brand new elements which we'll look at right now. Luckily for Rockstar, Max Payne's core combat has never strayed too far from the types of things they were already doing. By default, the reticles were always white dots in the middle of the screen, with Max Payne 2 actually giving you the ability to customize this to further suit your preferences. Here we're back to the white dot, but interestingly, despite still being fairly accurate when hip firing, we now see the inclusion of an ADS button. The purpose of this is obviously to make your shots more accurate, although I'm not entirely sure this was really needed. It's one of those things that I imagine was put in because almost every shooter now allows you to do this, but considering how similar and intense the combat is to the past titles, I don't think the increased accuracy is ever worth it. You're still going to have to be on the move constantly to survive. Although the caveat to that argument is the brand new cover system we see here. Basically ripped straight from GTA 4, the cover system is simplistic but effective. As opposed to that game, getting into cover here and moving around while in it is a lot faster, giving you a nice barrier of defense while not feeling like you're locked in place. You can of course exit this cover by either walking away or perhaps diving out, and I think it's effective here purely because of how these levels are laid out. I'm gonna class that as an overall positive. They have a mechanic, so they've curated the levels to adhere to this. But the strangest part about this is that other elements like shoot dodging are now put on the back burner slightly. So the level design here varies a lot. We go from these tight favelas, which are geniusly constructed to both be overwhelming in terms of enemies and the confusing pathways, all the way to this wide open airport. The favelas make up a large bulk of the time we spend in Sao Paulo, and as I said, these are tight, and rightfully so. It has the negative effect of feeling far too restrictive for a lot of people, and I totally get that. In linear games, you're always getting railroaded down particular paths, but typically developers include multiple pathways for the player to go down, simply to give the illusion of freedom. Say what you want about Call of Duty, but at a certain point, particularly games like COD 4 and World at War, there was a real variety of approaches to take, which for me not only introduced this freedom element, but also intrigued me enough to replay the games purely to see how the paths differed. There's near to no moments like that here. You're going through the same buildings in the same entrances entrances every time mainly. Enemy placement is about as you'd expect, although lacks that charming element which I very much enjoyed about the previous games, which makes the enemies lack a personality. Just because the game's content is far darker didn't mean these guys had to be as generic as they are. The cleaners might have looked similar in appearance, but I liked that. It made them a standout group with attire which was unique in terms of other games released similar to it. They also had those great missable moments which I mentioned earlier, like the guys playing piano and dancing around. Remedy went for the approach of having light-hearted elements in this dark world, very similar to Lynch, whereas in Max Payne 3 it's borderline depressing throughout the entire thing. The point we got majorly sidelined from though was the hampered shoot dodging, which you'll be able to see in several moments here. Due to the majority of these combat arenas being so tight, you're almost forced into cover at points. Attempting to use bullet time or dive around will simply lead to you being far too open, while at the same time not getting a good opportunity to get shots off. The realistic movement also applies to shoot dodging, where now diving into objects will see Max physically contort his body until he ends up crashing into it. Before, diving into walls looked really goofy, continuing the animation despite clearly being stopped. And even though this new impact looks great and I appreciate the want for consistency with the game's realistic look, it makes diving almost useless at points. I just don't think you get quite enough opportunities to really let loose with it. The exceptions are levels like the graveyard and airport obviously, the first of which takes place mainly outside, and the other of which is an open space with the removal of civilians, which would have otherwise made it clud. And of course, how could we forget the weapons, with there being the widest variety to choose from here. So many different kinds of shotguns, submachine guns and assault rifles, all of which look brilliant. The only possible issue though is that they may have been overwhelming if not for the biggest change here. Max can no longer carry every weapon he finds here, which is a very big switch up for the series. Although it was unrealistic, being able to carry all your weapons previously meant that each one was both easily accessible and also that each one had a specific purpose. The sheer magnitude of weapons here means that both of those things are turned on their head. There's multiple weapons that function almost exactly the same. The difference between the AK and FAL isn't very substantial. You can't notice any distinct differences in terms of their damage outputs or range. It is basically the GTA approach. They've got a wide arsenal at the consequence of some overlap, which, I'll be honest, I don't think was a great decision here. I get that realism was a clear priority. If Max was pulling everything out of his pocket at this point, it would look genuinely ridiculous, which is the best part. Every weapon you're carrying is considered in aspects like the cutscenes. If you're carrying an assault rifle before you enter one, they might not have Max holding it with two hands like you previously were, but you can still see him carrying it in his left hand. Same goes for all the different pistols and submachine guns you can carry. These are all accurately represented in the cutscenes. Ultimately though, there's an undeniable restriction now. You can't vary up your playstyle whenever you want because you just might not have access to certain weapons. That's an element that's also been dumbed down too, although I don't think it's as substantial as the weapon carrying system. Now you can pick up any enemy's weapon when killed, which could in turn replace a weapon that you're actively carrying. But there's hardly an actual ammo system here. You're never being encouraged to sort out secret stashes across each level, which I assume is once again down to how linear this experience is. It's definitely a double-edged sword. It's a good system in itself, but when comparing it to what we once had, arcadey or not, I personally think it was done better previously. The additions of being able to dual wield whatever two smaller weapons you're carrying is fantastic though, and no matter what weapon you're using, at the end of the day, the amount of destruction you can cause to your enemies is unparalleled. Bosses surprisingly make a return here despite never being fleshed out in any of the previous entries, and for the most part that stays consistent here. This goes for the antagonists in general too. They're nowhere near as memorable as characters like Vlad or Nicole Horn. The best villain we get here is Victor Bronco, but I always found his eventual betrayal of his family not as impactful as it could have been, due to the fact we don't spend enough time with him. Think about Vlad for example. His villain setup was carried out over the course of 2 games, and even in those games you're frequently interacting with him. The reason the betrayal works is because you understand his personality. Victor Bronco is more like a symbol compared to a character, an evil traitor who's willing to get almost all of his family killed simply for the power he could gain from it. The issue is that we just don't see him enough to make his ultimate conclusion as satisfying as it could have possibly been. That's really the case for every boss here though. We witness them throughout the game, but they're usually put in quite subtly during cutscenes. Good examples are like the end of the first mission where we see Backmire and Armando for the first time. Armando's slightly better as we see him during some conversations with the Broncos, but Backmire hardly reappears before you end up killing him. And unfortunately that's not all, as the boss fights themselves are just as simplistic as they've always been. The first one against Milo is a quick time event, something which used to be so commonplace in games during the 7th console generation, but luckily is dissipated, at least for now. I think he's got one of the best setups too, with there being a distinct yet small moment earlier on where him and his partner let you escape the stadium alive. It doesn't really make any sense, but the guy's appearance at least made him stick in my mind. The run up to this is also great, seeing Marcelo being burned alive in arguably one of the most brutal scenes in the game, so to have it capped off with some lame button prompts is disappointing. Backmire's boss fight is at least slightly interesting. The area you fight in is rather tight, but I liked how you have to figure out that shooting the ceiling is the way to beat him. On top of this multi-stage boss, we also get thrown some additional enemies alongside this. Usually I don't like that approach, much preferring being able to focus all my fire on a sole target. But with a fight like this, that's relatively simple anyway, I can appreciate the additional threats that keep you on the move. And for the first time, I think the final boss isn't awkward, underwhelming, or different from the entire experience. It's this gigantic set piece, starting off with you going up against seemingly the entire police force, along with Armando constantly shooting grenades at you, which, when you defeat him, also has the brilliant full circle moment which is set up at the start of the game. It's incredibly brutal, but also very satisfying. Same goes for when we take out Victor, where in the most bombastic moment of the game, we chase after his plane while shooting at it with a grenade launcher, leading to one of the most bone-shakingly horrible injuries I've seen in a game.
You know I walk. You'll walk with a lift!
Even if you're not attached to the new characters we meet in this game, it's undeniable that the ending is absolutely perfect. Max is one of the most tortured characters I've ever witnessed in gaming. No matter what he does, he always seems to end up losing things, getting into an even worse state than he was in before. But in an unexpected move, the ending here is wholly optimistic, seeing Max reflecting on the past while quite literally walking off into the sunset, hopefully from this point on staying away from everything that brought struggle into his life in the past. Finally, as you could guess, the sound of this game is spot on. There's so much going on in every single environment that you can't help but describe these places as completely lifelike. In the nightclub, you're not just hearing the sounds of screaming civilians and gunfire, but the music in this place is totally overwhelming that the scenario becomes even more authentic. We're dealing with a larger amount of locations as well as weather conditions in this game, which they somehow managed to all make individualized depending on where you are. The sounds in New York take us back to that isolating windswept city atmosphere.
You alright? Alright? Yeah, I'm good. I live right around the corner. Let's go this way. Let's go, man.
The bar was right around the corner from my apartment. It only took a few minutes to get back.
Then during moments like our sneaky infiltration into these swamplands, we appropriately hear all the nearby wildlife and the rain coming down from above. And our initial dive into Sao Paulo is filled with nearby conversations and shouting. Outside of the background music and the occasional cricket sound, it's ultimately what makes up this soundscape starting off. To contrast this though, when the guns start firing, the soundtrack elevates everything to an insane degree. All of the tracks are clearly individualized, just like the soundscapes. When you're fighting in Sao Paulo, you're hearing a frequent clatter of drums and percussion. Whereas fighting in New York, we're primarily hearing strings and bass hits. They suit the gameplay so well that it livens up the experience in a way that I wouldn't have thought was possible otherwise. Although, due to the fact these are more pared down, and I suppose cluttered to reflect your actions in-game, it also comes at the consequence of having no real memorable riffs. There's certain things that have stuck in my head over time, but nowhere near as much as some of the music from Max Payne 1 and 2, with 2 in particular having multiple background tracks with fantastic structures and melodies. I do like how dynamic these tracks are though, having distinct peaks and troughs depending on if you're actually fighting or not, something which GTA 5 also did very well after this. The sounds of the weapons are obviously all great. With the better hardware, we hear even more bite to everything, and explosions in particular feel massive, shown off most prominently when the Bronco headquarters is falling apart. It's a natural evolution of everything we've seen up to this point, and with Rockstar being in charge, it was almost impossible for all these sound effects to not be the most pristine at the time. There was also a multiplayer mode with Max Payne 3. I couldn't play it, but I do remember it being surprisingly good. So, because I can't talk about my own experience with this mode, let's talk about all the different modes which I skipped over before. You of course have all the different difficulty modes, those being Fugitive, Hard-Boiled, and Death on Arrival. These increasing difficulties change things like how much damage Max can take, how much damage the enemies can take, and I'm also pretty sure there's an overall decrease increase in the amount of painkillers and ammo you can find. This was the same for Max Payne 2, but as I mentioned earlier, incentivized the player to go through all the different difficulty settings to unlock the alternate ending, even though I don't think it's as impactful as the main one. Then in Max Payne 3, we just get the default easy, medium, and hard names, with there also being 2 brand new additions, those being hardcore and old school. Hardcore's just extra hard, whereas old school removes the last man standing ability, alongside this increased difficulty. Most of these settings are adaptive, with the game restoring your health and giving you bonus painkillers if you find yourself stuck at certain points. And overall, I think the difficulty settings are perfect for these games. It's a series that already promotes replayability, with its engaging combat and fairly short length. Well, at least the first 2. But simply by adding different difficulties, there'll be many players that will want to replay these games for the additional challenge alone. Alongside these were also extra modes that I'm sure many players found themselves spending a huge amount of hours in, as these focus on the raw gameplay, removing any inconveniences for those who have either already experienced or are just not interested in the game's story elements. In the first game we got New York Minute, a mode which gives the player 1 minute to complete every level in the game. That's obviously impossible, so the best part is how they encourage an absolutely ruthless playstyle, having to genuinely move at a breakneck pace to see these levels through to the end. Every kill adds a certain amount of time back to the timer, which is already great, blending the core gameplay and this timer well, instead of having some kind of pickups along the way that pauses it temporarily or something. The player has to know these levels back to front. They need to know what paths to go down instead of others, as any time loss, big or small, could potentially result in failure somewhere down the line. Then in Max Payne 2 we got the addition of Dead Man Walking, a survival based mode, which is purely a test of how long you can survive in a variety of areas. I'm not a big fan of how these enemies literally spawn out of thin air, because even though these white lights on the floor make a buzzing sound, it is still unclear when they're actually going to spawn in, and usually unclear which one of the spots they're coming in at. It's still a great combat focused mode though, realistically with as much replay value as you want, due to the fact you're always going to be looking for a higher score. Finally, in Max Payne 3 we still got New York Minute, but this time Dead Man Walking was replaced with Score Attack and Challenge mode. Both of these allow you to select any chapter throughout the game, ultimately to once again compete against your personal bests, as well as other people's scores this time round due to the online leaderboards. Nowadays these are completely screwed, as all the global scores are very blatantly hacked, but I'm sure at one time it might have been quite exciting to see how far up the leaderboard you could get. Score Attack is quite simply a mode where you need to rack up as many points as possible, with there being a number of different ways to multiply your score and get more points. These include things like consistently hitting every one of your targets, getting headshots, effectively using bullet time, and also the specific set pieces that occur at points. There's also Challenge mode, which is slightly more interesting to me due to the fact it actually switches up the levels somewhat, where after each checkpoint you're given a specific challenge to complete, like only killing enemies with explosives or shooting them in the groin. I appreciate this more than Score Attack, purely because it feels like something substantially different. Realistically, you could be judging your performance and wanting to improve from the base game alone. I don't think a score changes anything that much. Both of these are simply nowhere near as good as Dead Man Walking though, whereas that mode featured a unique objective with rising stakes. These modes are just retreading the same stuff with a slightly new coat of paint. I'm not saying they had to be anything really special, the base game speaks for itself in relation to the sheer effort that went into this game, but if they were going to add these modes with a ton of brand new skins like an old school Max and Beach Max outfit, I wish it would have been something other than the game I literally just completed. The Max Payne series has always appeared like something special to me. It's a series originally developed by a company with one game to their name, being a completely original and standalone idea, and yet, from how quality and distinct every single game is, it still became a recognizable franchise for a number of reasons. Despite all the developments we see throughout these 3 games, there's consistencies in relation to a large amount of facets that rightfully makes it feel like a trilogy. I'm not saying Max Payne 4 would be off the table for good, but these 3 games are all focused on 2 main things: the combat and Max himself, or the story, I guess. Yes, the jump from 2 to 3 is massive, both in tone and gameplay, but I think Rockstar ultimately succeeded in their efforts to stay true to what the series previously was, as well as making one of the most satisfying and polished shooters I've ever played. It's a series that I find so good and so replayable that I honestly don't mind if I never see a new game in the series ever again. It's unfortunate that my favourite game series, Metal Gear Solid, suffered that fate, ending off with a soulless and lazy cash grab that didn't understand the series' roots. I'd never want that to happen to Max Payne, but it's important to note that many people thought that's exactly what 3 did. I think over time people have come to appreciate how well crafted the game is, and much like how the series started, I look at Max Payne 3 like an anomaly. It's the last linear game Rockstar's created as of late, and it's been over a decade since it came out. It marked a bigger transition to me, not just as the grand cap-off to the franchise, but the gaming industry as a whole. I find it difficult to comprehend that you just don't get games like these anymore. I think I've established my recent distaste for the current gaming landscape. Everything I see seems to be polished polished and well made in their own right, but nothing stands out quite like these games did. There's an atmosphere, a passionate dedication to getting the combat just right, and true innovation in terms of the bullet time, although the series has been called out for certain shortcomings, whether it be the weird faces in 1, the short length of 2, or the grand departure of 3. For me, the games are just far too quality to be looked at as anything but brilliant. Throughout the history of gaming, there's only a select number of titles that I define as truly groundbreaking. Like I said in my GTA video, games like GTA 3, Zelda, Mario, Doom, Half-Life, those are what I consider groundbreaking. They're all wholly original in how they've been constructed, and I think Max Payne unfortunately gets overlooked a little too often, as the impact of these games can be seen frequently for me. Max Payne 3 might have been the end of an era, a final statement for the series, and the last proper attempt with these tightly constructed linear experiences. And even if we don't see anything to the level of Max Payne ever again, this trilogy includes some of the finest pieces of gaming media I've ever witnessed. 1 second, you won't be able to take your eyes off the screen because of the madness taking place, and the next you'll be wiping your eyes because of how fantastic their narratives are. It's a series that I'll always keep coming back to. It scratches an itch that seemingly no other game can. But for as many times as I guide this big dummy through a warehouse, or shoot my way through an organ harvesting den, or get incredibly freaked out when diving into Max's subconscious, I'll never get tired of it. And I'll never forget the impact these games have had on my own personal taste in games, and where the bar is for any shooter in the future.